The middle of the 9th century witnessed a profound transformation in Norse activity across Europe, transitioning from seasonal raiding toward territorial conquest and permanent settlement. This evolutionary leap found its most dramatic expression in the assembly, an operation of the Great Heathen Army that landed in East Anglia in 865 AD. Unlike previous raiding expeditions focused on portable wealth acquisition, this unprecedented Norse force pursued strategic conquest through sustained, coordinated campaigns. The army's arrival marked a watershed moment when Vikings transformed from external tormentors into aspiring rulers of European territories. The scale of this force dramatically exceeded previous Norse expeditions. While traditional raiding parties typically comprised a handful of ships carrying perhaps a few hundred warriors, contemporary sources describe the Great Heathen Army in terms reflecting genuine military threat to established kingdoms. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle characterizes it as a great host, unlike any previously seen. Modern scholarly estimates suggest combined force reaching several thousand warriors, transported by fleet numbering over 200 vessels. This quantitative leap represented qualitative transformation in Norse ambition, enabling sustained operations against organized resistance, rather than merely targeting undefended wealth concentrations. Motivation for this unprecedented expedition stemmed partly from desire to avenge the execution of legendary Norse leader Ragnar Lodbrok. According to sagas, Ragnar had been captured during raid into Northumbria and executed by King Ella through being thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. The historicity of this account remains debated, but its psychological impact on Norse collective consciousness proved undeniable. The desire for blood revenge provided powerful rallying cry, transcending normal competitive divisions among Norse factions, enabling unprecedented cooperation towards shared objective. This revenge motivation added ideological dimension beyond mere material acquisition, sustaining campaign through difficulties that might otherwise have prompted withdrawal. Leadership of this extraordinary force demonstrated sophistication, belying assumptions about Norse organizational limitations. Rather than operating under single commander, the army functioned through coordinated efforts of several prominent leaders, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba, traditionally identified as sons of Ragnar, seeking to avenge their father's death. This distributed command structure provided resilience against leadership casualties, while allowing simultaneous operations across multiple fronts. Their cooperation demonstrated Norse capacity for complex organizational arrangements when circumstances required transcending normally competitive relationships. This leadership approach balanced individual initiative with strategic coordination, creating operational flexibility that consistently confounded Anglo-Saxon defenders. Strategic conquest, rather than mere raiding, clearly distinguished this campaign from previous Norse activities. Rather than striking vulnerable targets and withdrawing with portable wealth, the Great Heathen Army pursued systematic reduction of Anglo-Saxon political and military power through destruction of opposing forces, elimination of ruling dynasties, and permanent occupation of conquered territories. This approach required entirely different operational model, sustained campaigning, territorial control, political reorganization of conquered regions, and development of governance systems, replacing defeated Anglo-Saxon structures. The army's operations consistently revealed this strategic depth, pursuing comprehensive conquest rather than opportunistic plundering. Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell one by one to sophisticated campaigns demonstrating Norse strategic acumen. East Anglia initially accommodated the army, providing horses and supplies in hopes of directing Norse attention elsewhere, temporary expedient that merely strengthened invaders for subsequent operations. Northumbria, divided by civil war between rival claimants, proved unable to present unified resistance and fell in 866 AD, with York becoming Norse power centre for generations. Mercia, though initially mounting significant resistance, succumbed to Norse military pressure by 874 AD. Each kingdom faced methodical reduction through combination of battlefield victories, leadership decapitation, and progressive territorial control, demonstrating Norse understanding of comprehensive conquest requirements beyond mere military dominance. Norse battlefield tactics reached peak effectiveness during these campaigns, particularly the shield wall formation, providing flexible defensive-offensive capability. This technique, where warriors created interlocked barrier with overlapping shields while maintaining offensive striking capability through gaps, proved devastatingly effective against Anglo-Saxon forces using similar tactics but lacking Norse discipline and experience. Contemporary accounts describe war hedge, that opponents could neither break nor circumvent, allowing Norse forces to withstand numerically superior opposition while maintaining formation integrity until tactical advantage presented itself. This battlefield effectiveness ensured Norse forces could directly confront Anglo-Saxon armies, rather than merely avoiding them as earlier raiders had typically done. The systematic nature of Norse conquest revealed itself through deliberate targeting of political and religious centres embodying Anglo-Saxon power structures. York, London, and other urban centres received particular attention, not merely as wealth concentrations, but as symbolic and practical governance centres. Religious establishments faced similar systematic attention, with monastery destruction representing not random violence, but deliberate elimination of institutions supporting Anglo-Saxon spiritual and cultural identity. This comprehensive approach demonstrated Norse understanding that conquest required more than battlefield victory. It necessitated dismantling underlying structures, supporting resistance while establishing alternative systems under Norse control. Winter campaigning represented revolutionary departure from previous seasonal raiding patterns and devastating innovation against Anglo-Saxon defensive assumptions. Traditional Norse operations had followed seasonal patterns, allowing defenders reasonable expectations regarding timing and duration of threat. The Great Heathen Army deliberately violated these expectations by maintaining year-round operational presence, denying defenders traditional winter respite for recovery and reorganization. This sustained pressure prevented effective resistance regeneration while creating cumulative advantages for invading forces. The psychological impact of permanent rather than seasonal threat fundamentally altered defense calculation throughout Anglo-Saxon territories, forcing impossible choice between exhausting continuous mobilization or accepting progressive territorial loss. Only Wessex, under Alfred the Great, ultimately withstood this Norse onslaught, preserving nucleus of Anglo-Saxon independence through combination of military adaptation, political reform, and strategic flexibility. Alfred's success stemmed partly from learning Norse methods, building defensive burhs controlling territory, developing mobile forces capable of rapid response, establishing early warning systems, and creating naval capacity challenging Norse maritime dominance. His preservation of Wessex would eventually enable Anglo-Saxon resurgence, but immediate consequence remained unprecedented Norse territorial control across 580 eastern and northern England, transforming political landscape for generations and establishing foundation for permanent Norse presence within British Isles. The military successes of the Great Heathen Army necessarily evolved toward political consolidation, as Norse forces transitioned from conquest to governance across substantial territories. The establishment of the Danelaw, regions under Norse political control and legal systems, represented formal institutionalization of Viking authority across eastern and northern England. This territorial division, formalized through treaty between Alfred and Norse leader Guthrum in 886 AD, acknowledged reality of Norse political dominance while establishing framework for coexistence between Anglo-Saxon and Norse populations. The Danelaw's creation marked decisive transition from Viking raiders to permanent political actors within European power structures. Geographical partition assigned approximately half of England to Norse control, with boundary running roughly from London along River Lea to Bedford, following Ouse to Watling Street and northward. This division reflected military reality rather than negotiated compromise, essentially recognizing territories Norse forces already controlled through conquest. The resulting Norse-dominated region encompassed East Anglia, Eastern Mercia, and York, including some of England's most productive agricultural lands and important trading centres. This substantial territorial base provided economic foundation for sustainable Norse presence beyond mere military occupation, enabling development of functioning society rather than simply extraction economy. Viking settlement brought substantial Scandinavian population influx as Norse warriors transitioned from invaders to settlers with permanent stake in territorial prosperity. Archaeological evidence and place name analysis suggest significant Scandinavian migration following initial conquest, with families joining warriors who had participated in original campaigns. This settlement pattern transformed military occupation into demographic presence with long-term implications for regional development. Unlike earlier raids, extracting wealth for consumption elsewhere, settlement created incentives for sustainable economic development and political stability benefiting Norse inhabitants alongside subject populations. Norse legal systems imposed on conquered territories reflected distinctive Scandinavian approaches to governance, property rights, and dispute resolution, while allowing substantial local autonomy in many matters. Norse authorities implemented legal principles markedly different from Anglo-Saxon precedents. These included emphasis on compensation rather than punishment for offences, different approaches to property ownership and inheritance, and distinctive judicial procedures for resolving disputes. The term Danelaw itself referenced this legal distinctiveness, acknowledging regions where people lived under Norse rather than Anglo-Saxon law. This legal differentiation represented a crucial aspect of cultural transformation beyond mere political control. Cultural integration between Anglo-Saxons and Norse settlers proceeded unevenly but inexorably following initial conquest period. While early phases witnessed clear distinction between conquerors and conquered, subsequent decades saw increasing intermarriage, cultural exchange, and hybrid institutional development. Archaeological evidence reveals progressive adoption of Norse styles, technologies, and practices by native populations, while Norse settlers similarly incorporated advantageous Anglo-Saxon elements into their culture. This integration process accelerated through practical necessity of daily interaction in commercial, agricultural, and governance contexts. The resulting syncretism created distinctive regional identity, neither purely Scandinavian nor Anglo-Saxon, but unique amalgamation evolved through prolonged coexistence. Economic transformation under Norse governance significantly impacted regional development patterns. Norse commercial networks connected Danelaw territories to wider Scandinavian trading systems extending to Dublin, the Baltic, and beyond. York emerged as major commercial centre under Norse control, archaeological evidence revealing substantial international trade including Arabic coins, Baltic amber, and continental goods. Agricultural methods showed similar innovation, with Norse approaches to land management and stock raising integrated with existing practices. These economic developments transcended mere change in political control, representing fundamental reorientation toward different commercial systems and priorities under Norse governance. Religious dynamics within the Danelaw revealed complex interplay between Norse paganism and Christianity among both conquerors and subject populations. Initial conquest phase had featured deliberate targeting of Christian institutions as symbols of Anglo-Saxon authority, but subsequent settlement period witnessed more nuanced religious landscape. Some Norse settlers maintained traditional religious practices, archaeological evidence showing continued pagan burials and ritual deposits. Others adopted Christianity, particularly those intermarrying with local populations or seeking to enhance trade relationships with Christian territories. This religious diversity created distinctive environment, unlike both fully Christian Anglo-Saxon regions and predominantly pagan Scandinavia, with varied practices coexisting within same communities. Anglo-Saxon resistance under Alfred the Great preserved crucial territorial base in Wessex, from which eventual reconquest would proceed. Alfred's systematic reforms, military reorganization, burh construction, naval development, legal codification, educational initiatives, created governance capacity far exceeding previous Anglo-Saxon arrangements. This comprehensive program maintained Wessex independence while establishing foundation for potential expansion when circumstances permitted. The Treaty of Wedmore temporarily halted direct conflict, but clearly represented tactical pause rather than permanent resolution from Alfred's perspective. His strategic vision anticipated eventual Anglo-Saxon resurgence, despite acknowledging immediate Norse territorial dominance. Shield wall tactics reached peak effectiveness during this period, as both Norse and Anglo-Saxon forces mastered formation fighting techniques. These tactics, where warriors formed interconnected defensive lines with overlapping shields while maintaining offensive capability, dominated battlefield encounters between relatively evenly matched forces. The methodology required extensive training, absolute discipline, and psychological commitment maintaining formation, despite casualties and fear. Success depended on collective performance rather than individual heroics, representing evolution beyond earlier, more individualistic combat approaches. These sophisticated tactical systems demonstrated growing military professionalism on both sides, compared to earlier, more opportunistic warfare. Norse political control shifted from military occupation toward institutionalized governance as settlement proceeded. Initial leadership by conquest-era commanders gradually evolved toward established administrative structures for tax collection, justice administration, and territorial defense. Norse jarls established regional authority, supported by thanes and other subordinate officials, creating governance hierarchy paralleling but distinct from Anglo-Saxon equivalents. This administrative development transformed Norse presence from extractive military domination towards sustainable governance system, maintaining order, resolving disputes, and facilitating economic activity. The resulting political arrangement proved sufficiently stable to endure for generations, despite periodic challenges from resurgent Anglo-Saxon forces. The Danelaw's establishment represented culmination of Viking transformation from external raiders to internal rulers within European political landscape. What had begun as opportunistic coastal raids had evolved through deliberate conquest into permanent political presence, controlling substantial territory and population. This evolutionary process demonstrated Norse adaptability well beyond narrow raiding expertise, encompassing governance capabilities, legal administration, economic management, and cultural integration. The resulting hybrid society, neither purely Scandinavian nor Anglo-Saxon but distinctive synthesis, would leave permanent imprint on English development even after eventual Anglo-Saxon reconquest generations later. The establishment of permanent Norse settlements throughout conquered territories introduced crucial demographic element, largely absent from earlier raiding phase: women. Female colonists accompanying male settlers fundamentally transformed Norse presence from military occupation toward genuine society capable of self-perpetuation and cultural development. Understanding these women's roles, legal standing, and cultural impact reveals essential dimension of Norse expansion, frequently overshadowed by more dramatic military narratives. Their presence represented decisive factor, distinguishing temporary conquest from permanent demographic transformation, with centuries-long implications. Female colonists establishing Norse households across newly conquered territories created stability essential for sustainable settlement rather than mere occupation. Archaeological evidence increasingly reveals substantial female Scandinavian presence throughout Danelaw territories, contradicting earlier assumptions about predominantly male migration. Grave goods, household artifacts, and jewelry distinctively Scandinavian in design demonstrate women maintaining cultural practices while establishing domestic foundations in new lands. Their arrival transformed military camps into functioning communities, capable of generational continuity, rather than requiring constant reinforcement from Scandinavian homelands. Legal rights and divorce customs imported from Scandinavia significantly impacted women's position within settler communities. Norse women traditionally maintained substantial property rights, control over household economics, and legal ability to initiate divorce under specific circumstances. These provisions, considerably more favorable than contemporary Anglo-Saxon equivalents, accompanied Norse settlement through legal customs maintained within Danelaw territories. Documentary and archaeological evidence suggests Norse women in settled territories continued exercising these rights, maintaining economic autonomy unusual by contemporary standards elsewhere in Europe. This legal distinctiveness created society where women maintained agency unmatched in neighboring regions. Property ownership patterns directly influenced settlement distribution, as Norse families established farms and holdings, reflecting distinctive Scandinavian approaches to land management. Place name evidence reveals concentrated Scandinavian settlement in specific regions, often establishing new farmsteads rather than merely occupying existing Anglo-Saxon properties. The resulting settlement pattern reflected hybrid approach, integrating Norse concepts of appropriate land utilization with practical realities of existing agricultural systems. Women played crucial role in these settlement decisions, their expertise in household management and textile production directly influencing site selection and development priorities. The resulting landscape bore unmistakable imprint of female practical priorities, alongside male military considerations. Household management responsibilities placed Norse women at center of settlement economic activity, creating stability essential for community development. While male settlers might continue participating in seasonal raiding or trading expeditions, women maintained agricultural production, textile manufacturing, food processing, and child-rearing activities representing economic foundation for Norse communities. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites reveals distinctively Scandinavian approaches to these activities, introduced through female expertise rather than male military presence. The resulting economic stability enabled long-term community development, transcending initial conquest phase, creating self-sustaining societies rather than dependent outposts requiring constant external support. Evidence of female warriors appears in burial sites throughout Norse territories, suggesting gender roles maintained greater flexibility than often assumed. The famous Birka warrior grave, initially assumed male but genetically confirmed female, represents most prominent example of this phenomenon. While female combatants clearly remained minority compared to males, their existence demonstrates Norse society allowed greater gender role flexibility than contemporary cultures elsewhere in Europe. This openness to female participation in traditionally male domains extended beyond warfare into trade, crafts, and possibly religious leadership, creating distinctive social environment where exceptional women could transcend normal gender boundaries when circumstances required. Cultural exchange began accelerating as Norse women interacted with local populations through daily activities. Textile techniques, food preparation methods, child-rearing practices, and household management approaches represented domains where practical interaction transcended linguistic or religious differences. Archaeological evidence shows progressive hybridization in these domains, with distinctive Norse elements incorporated into local practice, while settlers simultaneously adopted advantageous indigenous methods. Women served as primary agents in this cultural exchange through their central role in domestic activities, where such practical integration naturally occurred. The resulting cultural synthesis created distinctive regional identities, neither purely Scandinavian nor Anglo-Saxon. Marriage patterns reveal complex relationship between conquerors and local populations evolving over time. Initial settlement phase likely featured Norse men taking Anglo-Saxon wives or concubines through various arrangements from outright capture to negotiated alliances. As female Norse settlers arrived, intermarriage continued, but within more balanced demographic context. Children from these unions grew up within hybrid households, incorporating elements from both parental cultures, creating transitional generation bridging formerly distinct identities. Within several generations, rigid distinction between Norse and native had significantly eroded through complex intermarriage patterns, creating population increasingly identifying with regional rather than ethnic identity. Religious practices among female settlers demonstrated similar complexity and adaptation. Some Norse women maintained traditional religious activities related to household protection, fertility, and healing. Archaeological evidence showing continued use of amulets and ritual objects associated with Norse goddesses like Freya. Others adopted Christianity through interaction with local populations or conversion alongside male family members. Many likely maintained elements of both religious systems simultaneously, pragmatically invoking different spiritual authorities for various purposes. Women often served as primary religious instructors for children, their choices regarding spiritual practice significantly influencing generational religious evolution within settler communities. Linguistic transformation proceeded partly through female influence, particularly regarding vocabulary related to domestic activities, childcare, and social relationships. The significant Old Norse contribution to English vocabulary stems partly from intimate household interactions where women played central role. Children growing up hearing both languages naturally incorporated elements from each, creating distinctive regional dialects that would eventually influence standard English development. Place names throughout Danelaw territories similarly reflect this linguistic hybridization, with thousands of locations still bearing, partly or wholly, Scandinavian names, reflecting initial settler identification of landscape features, settlements, and agricultural divisions. By establishing permanent household presence, Norse women transformed what might have remained temporary military occupation into genuine demographic change with permanent implications for European development. Their practical expertise, cultural knowledge, reproductive capacity, and economic management created sustainable communities transcending initial conquest dynamics. The resulting hybrid society incorporated elements from both Norse and indigenous cultures, creating distinctive regional identities that would persist long after political control shifted back toward Anglo-Saxon dominance. This female-driven transformation represents an essential dimension of Norse expansion, often overlooked in military-focused histories, but crucial for understanding its lasting impact on European development. While Norse expansion established substantial territorial presence across British Isles, equally significant development occurred along continental Europe's northern coast, through establishment of region that would eventually bear unmistakable evidence of its Scandinavian founders in its very name, Normandy. The establishment of this distinctive political entity developed through evolutionary process, beginning with typical raiding patterns, but culminating in formal political recognition unprecedented in Norse-European relations. Understanding Normandy's foundation reveals how Viking expansion ultimately produced sophisticated political entities, fully integrated into European power structures, while maintaining distinctive Norse characteristics. Rollo's campaigns in Francia demonstrated evolving ambitions, characterizing later Viking activity, focused increasingly on territorial control rather than merely portable wealth. Though historical sources offer conflicting accounts regarding his origins, whether Norwegian or Danish, all agree on his emergence as formidable leader, capable of coordinating substantial forces in sustained campaigns along Seine Valley and surrounding territories. Unlike earlier raiders concerned primarily with immediate plunder, Rollo exhibited strategic patience, political acumen, and territorial ambition, transcending typical Viking opportunism. His operations consistently revealed intention to establish permanent presence, rather than merely extract resources for consumption elsewhere. The Siege of Paris in 885 to 886 AD showcased Norse military capability at unprecedented scale, while simultaneously revealing limitations of purely extractive strategy. This massive operation, involving reported 700 ships and thousands of warriors, demonstrated organizational capacity far beyond stereotypical raider bands. The siege continued nearly a year, with Norse forces constructing substantial works, employing siege equipment, and maintaining operational coherence through extended campaign. Despite this impressive effort, Paris ultimately withstood the assault through combination of physical defenses, determined resistance, and eventual relief. This qualified failure likely influenced subsequent Norse leaders, like Rollo, toward recognizing benefits of negotiated political accommodation rather than perpetual conflict. Peace negotiations, culminating in Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte in 911 AD, established revolutionary precedent in Norse-European relations by transforming former raiders into legitimate political actors within European framework. Under this agreement between Frankish King Charles the Simple and Norse leader Rollo, substantial territory around Seine estuary transferred to Norse control in exchange for three crucial commitments: defending the region against other Viking raiders, accepting nominal vassalage to Frankish crown, and converting to Christianity. This arrangement represented sophisticated compromise, addressing both Frankish desire for stabilized northern frontier a Norse aspiration for legitimate territorial authority beyond mere conquest. The territory granted through this agreement encompassed strategically vital region, controlling Seine access to Paris, and important coastal areas, including present-day Rouen. While modest compared to later Norman holdings, this initial grant provided crucial territorial base from which subsequent expansion would proceed. The region's agricultural productivity, commercial potential through river access, and defensible geography created viable foundation for sustainable political entity rather than merely extractive outpost. This territorial grant transformed Norse presence from external threat into internal political actor, with vested interest in regional stability, fundamentally altering relationship between former raiders and Frankish kingdom. Conversion to Christianity represented crucial component of political legitimization process, transforming Norse settlers from pagan outsiders to theoretical equals within European Christian framework. Rollo's baptism, though likely representing political calculation rather than genuine spiritual transformation, nevertheless created foundation for progressive integration of Norse population into Christian European society. Subsequent church construction, monastery establishment, and ecclesiastical organization throughout Norman territory demonstrated commitment to religious infrastructure essential for political legitimization. This religious transformation, whatever its spiritual sincerity, facilitated Norman participation in European political systems, where Christian identity constituted prerequisite for legitimate authority. Normans began assimilation into Frankish culture with remarkable rapidity, while simultaneously maintaining distinctive Norse characteristics, creating unique hybrid identity. Within generation, Norse language largely gave way to Romance speech that would evolve into Norman French, though substantial Norse vocabulary remained particularly regarding maritime, legal, and military terminology. Legal systems similarly combined Frankish written tradition with Norse procedural elements and social concepts. Political structures integrated Frankish feudal frameworks with Norse emphasis on personal loyalty and demonstrated capability. This selective assimilation reflected pragmatic Norse adaptability rather than wholesale abandonment of cultural identity. Administration of newly established Norman territory revealed sophisticated governance capacity beyond mere military occupation. Rollo and successors developed administrative systems collecting taxes, resolving disputes, organizing defense, and managing economic development across their domain. Documentary evidence shows progressive development of written administration, alongside traditional Norse emphasis on assembly-based governance. This administrative capability demonstrated Norse capacity for constructive governance beyond raiding expertise, creating sustainable political entity rather than merely extractive regime. The resulting governance model proved sufficiently robust to maintain internal stability while facilitating expansion during subsequent generations. Norman military organization maintained distinctive Norse elements while incorporating Frankish innovations, particularly regarding cavalry warfare. The resulting synthesis created formidable fighting capability, combining Norse infantry traditions with continental heavy cavalry tactics. Norman warriors maintained Norse emphasis on discipline, unit cohesion, and tactical flexibility, while adopting equipment and techniques suited to their new environment. This military adaptability ensured Normans remained formidable fighting force, despite cultural assimilation in other domains. Their reputation for military effectiveness became a defining characteristic that would eventually enable Norman expansion far beyond original territories. Seeds of future Norman conquests were planted in first-generation, following settlement through combination of factors distinguishing this Norse colony from others. The legitimacy derived from formal political recognition created foundation for participation in European power politics, impossible for groups maintaining purely antagonistic relationship with existing powers. Geographic position facilitated interaction with multiple political systems, Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, Breton, creating diplomatic and military opportunities beyond isolated Viking settlements elsewhere. The hybrid cultural identity, developing through selective assimilation and innovation, created distinctive Norman capability transcending limitations of either parent culture. These advantages would eventually enable Norman expansion, transforming European political landscape through conquests in England, Sicily, and beyond. The Normandy experiment demonstrated Norse capacity for political evolution, from raiders to rulers, through process fundamentally different from Danelaw establishment. While Danelaw emerged through direct conquest, followed by settlement, Normandy developed through negotiated agreement, creating legitimate political entity from outset. This distinctive foundation established precedent for integration of Norse elements into European political structures through accommodation rather than merely conflict. The resulting Norman identity, neither fully Scandinavian nor Frankish, but distinctive synthesis, would eventually produce one of medieval Europe's most dynamic political forces, demonstrating how thoroughly Viking raiders could transform into sophisticated European political actors within remarkably few generations. While Danelaw and Normandy represented most politically formalized outcomes of Norse expansion, equally significant developments unfolded throughout Celtic territories comprising Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Here, Norse influence manifested through distinctive patterns, reflecting both local conditions and evolving Viking priorities. Understanding these regional variations reveals Norse adaptability in different environments, while demonstrating how their expansion catalyzed transformative political and cultural developments across Celtic world, with centuries-long implications for European development. Norse Gaelic kingdoms flourished in Ireland, establishing distinctive hybrid political entities, blending Scandinavian and Celtic elements into unique synthesis. Dublin, founded as Norse settlement around 841 AD, emerged as centre of substantial kingdom-controlling surrounding territories, while maintaining maritime connections with wider Norse world. Similar developments at Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, and other coastal locations created network of Norse-dominated urban centres, contrasting with predominantly rural Gaelic political organisation. These settlements originally functioned primarily as raid bases and slave markets, but evolved into sophisticated commercial centres with extensive international connections. Archaeological evidence reveals substantial trade networks linking these Irish Norse kingdoms with England, continental Europe, and beyond. Cultural interaction between Norse settlers and Irish population created distinctive hybrid society, apparent in archaeological record and historical documentation. Artistic styles blended Celtic and Scandinavian motifs, creating unique aesthetic apparent in metalwork, stone carving, and manuscript illumination. Linguistic evidence shows significant Norse vocabulary incorporation, particularly regarding maritime activities, commerce, and urban administration. Religious accommodation saw initial pagan Norse settlers gradually adopting Christianity while retaining distinctive cultural practices. This integration process accelerated through intermarriage between Norse elite and Irish noble families, creating influential hybrid dynasties, maintaining connections with both parent cultures. Irish political development accelerated partly in response to Norse presence, catalyzing consolidation previously unlikely in highly fragmented Gaelic system. The threat posed by Norse settlements stimulated formation of larger political units capable of organizing effective resistance. High kings, like Brian Boru, gained unprecedented authority partly through demonstrated ability to counter Norse expansion. Paradoxically, Norse military technology and organizational techniques often proved crucial to these Irish consolidation efforts, with Irish leaders adopting elements of Norse weaponry, ship design, and tactical approaches. This catalytic effect represents significant instance of Norse expansion, indirectly transforming political systems beyond areas under their direct control. Orkney and Shetland became thoroughly Viking territories, with Norse settlement effectively replacing, rather than blending with previous Pictish population. These northern islands, geographically closest to Scandinavia, experienced most complete Norse cultural transformation among British territories. Archaeological evidence shows overwhelming Norse material culture. Place names remain almost exclusively Scandinavian, and genetic studies suggest substantial population replacement rather than merely elite dominance. The resulting island societies functioned effectively as Scandinavian outposts, maintaining closer connection with Norse homeland than other settlement regions. Their strategic position, controlling northern sea routes, ensured continued importance throughout Viking Age and beyond. The Norse earldom, established over Orkney, demonstrated sophisticated political organization, integrating island territories into coherent entity, maintaining significant independence while acknowledging nominal Norwegian overlordship. The Orkney Earls controlled substantial maritime power, dominated surrounding waters, and frequently intervened in Scottish mainland affairs. Their authority extended periodically to Hebrides, parts of mainland Scotland, and occasionally Irish territories, creating significant regional power transcending limited territorial base. This political entity, thoroughly Norse in character, while fully adapted to local conditions, demonstrated Viking capacity for creating sustainable governance structures rather than merely extractive occupation. Kingdom of Man, established as strategic control point at Irish Sea's centre, represented another distinctive Norse political creation with substantial regional impact. From this island base, Norse rulers controlled crucial maritime crossroads between Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales. The resulting kingdom maintained distinctive hybrid character, blending Norse political organization with Celtic cultural elements while developing extensive maritime commerce alongside periodic raiding. The famous ship burials at Balladul and other Manx sites demonstrate continued Norse cultural practices, while distinctive stone crosses show Celtic artistic influence alongside Scandinavian motifs. This hybridization created unique Manx identity, still evident in Ireland's distinctive language, legal system, and political institutions. Welsh resistance in mountainous interior, limited Norse penetration primarily to coastal regions and temporary raid bases rather than permanent settlement zones. The topographical challenges presented by Welsh terrain proved less suitable for Norse settlement patterns developed in eastern England or coastal Ireland. While archaeological evidence confirms Norse presence along Welsh coasts and significant raiding activity, permanent Norse political control remained limited compared to other Celtic regions. Nevertheless, economic and cultural impact extended beyond these limited territorial holdings. Through trade connections, artistic influence, and occasional political alliances between Welsh rulers and Norse leaders against common enemies. This limited but persistent interaction contributed to distinctive Welsh development throughout Viking Age. Intermarriage between Norse settlers and local populations throughout Celtic regions created influential hybrid dynasties, maintaining connections with both parent cultures. Figures like Gofraid MacFergusa, Amlaib Quaran, and other Norse Gaelic rulers demonstrated capacity to operate effectively within both cultural worlds, utilizing relationships with Scandinavian, Irish, Scottish, and occasionally English powers. These dynastic connections facilitated trade networks transcending cultural boundaries, while creating distinctive political entities, neither fully Norse nor Celtic. The resulting hybrid aristocracy maintained considerable power throughout northern British Isles for generations, their divided cultural loyalties sometimes creating political instability, but also facilitating intercultural communication otherwise impossible. Material culture throughout these regions flourished through combination of Norse and Celtic artistic traditions, creating distinctive hybrid styles still evident in archaeological record. Metalwork particularly shows this synthesis, with Viking decorative elements adapted to traditional Celtic forms and vice versa. Stone sculpture similarly demonstrates cultural blending, with Norse motifs appearing on traditionally Celtic monuments, while Scandinavian memorial stones incorporate Christian symbolism. Jewelry, domestic items, and weapons show similar integration of aesthetic traditions, creating material culture reflecting neither pure Norse nor Celtic influences, but distinctive regional syntheses. This artistic hybridization visually represented the broader cultural integration occurring throughout these territories. The lasting legacy of Norse activity across Scotland, Wales, and Ireland extended far beyond their period of direct political control. Place names throughout these regions, particularly coastal areas and islands, still reflect Scandinavian linguistic influence. Political configurations catalyzed partly through Norse presence shaped subsequent development for centuries. Trading networks established during Viking Age created economic connections outlasting their founders. Perhaps most significantly, the hybrid cultural identities forged through interaction between Norse and Celtic populations contributed distinctive elements to regional development far beyond Viking Age itself. This transformative impact, though less formally institutionalized than Danelaw or Normandy, nevertheless represents equally significant dimension of Norse expansion's lasting historical consequences. Behind the dramatic military campaigns and political transformations of this period, equally significant developments unfolded in material culture throughout Norse-influenced territories. As Vikings transitioned from raiders to settlers and rulers, their artistic traditions, craftsmanship, and material production underwent revolutionary evolution, reflecting both internal development and cross-cultural exchange. The resulting material flowering created distinctive aesthetic traditions and technological innovations that both reflected and facilitated broader cultural transformations, reshaping Northern Europe during this pivotal century. Artistic styles blending Norse and local influences created unique aesthetic traditions throughout settled territories. In England, stone sculpture combined Anglo-Saxon Christian iconography with Norse decorative elements, creating monuments like the Gosforth Cross, where Christ's crucifixion appears alongside imagery from Norse mythology. Metalwork similarly demonstrated creative synthesis, with traditional Norse animal styles adapted to new forms while incorporating techniques and motifs from host cultures. This artistic hybridization visually represented broader cultural integration occurring through settlement, creating material expression of emerging composite identities, neither purely Scandinavian nor indigenous, but distinctive regional syntheses. Metalwork achieved new heights of sophistication as Norse craftsmen established permanent workshops in conquered territories while absorbing techniques from host cultures. The resulting products, Brooches, sword hilts, belt fittings, vessels demonstrated technical excellence, combining traditional Norse decorative approaches with new materials and methods. Silver working particularly flourished through access to substantial precious metal acquired through raiding, tribute, and trade. The resulting jewelry and decorative items served simultaneously as portable wealth, status indicators, and artistic expressions. Archaeological discoveries like Kurdal Hoard reveal extraordinary quality and quantity of silver production, directly connected to Norse economic activities throughout the period. Jewelry and personal adornment reflected wealth and status, while simultaneously expressing cultural identity within diverse settled communities. Traditional Norse brooch types evolved distinctive regional variations reflecting local influences and practical conditions. Arm rings and neck rings served as both decorative items and currency, their weight standardization facilitating economic transactions, while their visibility demonstrated wearers' prosperity. The distribution of these personal items in archaeological contexts reveals both persistence of Scandinavian cultural identity among settlers and progressive adoption of Norse styles by indigenous populations. This material expression of identity played a crucial role in negotiating complex social relationships within multicultural communities, emerging throughout Norse-controlled territories. Domestic crafts adapted to new environments while maintaining distinctive Norse characteristics. Textile production incorporated new materials and techniques while preserving traditional Scandinavian patterns and weaving methods. Pottery forms evolved regional variations, reflecting both Norse aesthetic preferences and practical adaptation to local resources. Woodworking traditions demonstrated similar adaptation, with Norse carving styles applied to furniture and architectural elements while incorporating host culture practices. These domestic items, less spectacular than precious metalwork, but more intimately connected to daily life, demonstrate how thoroughly Norse cultural practices penetrated everyday existence throughout settled territories, while simultaneously adapting to new circumstances. Trade goods flowed through Viking-controlled networks at unprecedented volume, archaeological evidence revealing remarkable commercial integration across formerly fragmented regions. Arabic coins, Baltic amber, Rhenish glass, Irish metalwork, and countless other items circulated throughout Norse-dominated territories through commercial systems controlling key waterways and urban centers. York, under Norse control, developed extensive international connections visible through extraordinary diversity of archaeological materials from throughout known world. Dublin similarly emerged as major commercial centre linking Ireland with broader Norse trading sphere. This commercial integration created economic foundations supporting political and cultural developments, while accelerating cross-cultural exchange between formerly isolated regions. Weapons evolution reflected changing warfare requirements as Norse forces transitioned from primarily shipborne raiders toward territorial armies, with diverse operational demands. Sword typologies show progressive adaptation, with traditional Norse patterns incorporating features from Frankish and Anglo-Saxon traditions, while developing distinctive regional variations. Shield designs similarly evolved from simple round shields toward more specialized forms suited for different combat environments. This material evolution reflected broader military adaptation, as Norse forces encountered new challenges requiring tactical and equipment modifications beyond their original maritime raiding specialization. The resulting synthesis created distinctive martial traditions, combining elements from various cultural traditions into effective new forms. Ship construction continued evolving to meet changing requirements as Norse maritime activities diversified beyond raiding toward trade colonization, and political consolidation. Specialized vessel types emerged for different functions. merchant ships optimized for cargo capacity, distinctive warship designs for various military applications, specialized craft for riverine operations. Archaeological discoveries like Gokstad and Oseberg ships reveal extraordinary sophistication in naval architecture, combining practical effectiveness with aesthetic refinement and symbolic significance. These vessels represented not merely transportation technology, but material embodiments of Norse identity and capability, their construction and decoration receiving attention beyond purely utilitarian considerations. Architectural development throughout Norse-controlled territories demonstrated similar pattern of cultural synthesis and practical adaptation. Longhouse construction incorporated local building materials and techniques, while maintaining traditional Norse spatial organization and functional elements. Urban settlements established under Norse control combined Scandinavian planning concepts with indigenous building traditions, creating distinctive townscapes visible in archaeological record at York, Dublin, and other centres. Religious structures evolved from traditional Norse formats toward Christian models, though often retaining distinctive elements reflecting Scandinavian aesthetic preferences. This architectural evolution physically manifested broader cultural transformations, reshaping Northern European built environment throughout the period. Runic inscriptions spread throughout Norse-controlled territories, adapting traditional Scandinavian writing system to new linguistic and cultural contexts. Memorial stones recording deaths, commemorating achievements, or marking territorial claims proliferated across settled regions, their texts providing valuable historical evidence, while their physical presence represented permanent material expression of Norse cultural presence. The adaptation of runic writing to include Christian invocations alongside traditional formulas visually demonstrates cultural synthesis occurring throughout society. These inscriptions, combining textual content with decorative elements, represent crucial bridge between material culture and historical documentation, otherwise rare for this period. Burial practices throughout Norse settlement zones reveal complex interplay between traditional Scandinavian customs and influences from host cultures. Ship burials and cremations with distinctive Norse grave goods continued in some regions, demonstrating persistence of traditional religious beliefs and cultural practices. Elsewhere, progressive adoption of Christian burial customs reflected religious conversion, while often maintaining distinctive Norse elements in grave goods or monument styles. This diversity in mortuary practice, frequently visible within same communities, reveals complex religious landscape where traditional and new beliefs coexisted during transitional period lasting generations, rather than representing sudden cultural transformation. By centuries' end, the material culture flowering throughout Norse-controlled territories had created distinctive regional traditions, representing neither purely Scandinavian heritage nor unmodified host cultures, but unique syntheses reflecting complex socio-political realities. These material expressions, from monumental sculpture to personal adornment, from weapons to domestic items, provide tangible evidence of broader cultural transformations reshaping Northern Europe during this pivotal period. The resulting hybrid traditions would continue influencing European material development long after Viking political dominance had faded, their aesthetic and technological innovations becoming permanently integrated into European cultural expression. As Norse expansion continued transforming European political landscape through conquest and settlement, equally significant developments unfolded through exploration and colonization of previously uninhabited or sparsely populated territories across North Atlantic. Among these ventures, none proved more consequential than Norse settlement of Iceland, remote island whose colonization represented unprecedented maritime achievement, while eventually producing unique society, preserving Norse cultural elements long after they had faded elsewhere. The Iceland venture demonstrated Viking capacity for planned colonization, beyond opportunistic raiding or conquest, establishing foundation for subsequent exploration further westward. Political refugees from Norway's unification provided crucial initial impetus for Icelandic settlement, as King Harald Fairhair's consolidation of power displaced previously independent regional leaders. Traditional Norse society had featured numerous local chieftains maintaining substantial autonomy, with limited overarching authority. Harald's military campaigns systematically reduced these independent power centers, forcing defeated opponents to choose between submission to unprecedented centralized authority or exile. Many chose the latter, seeking territories beyond Harald's reach, where traditional Norse autonomy could be maintained. This political motivation created a pool of experienced, well-resourced leaders, uniquely motivated and capable of organizing substantial colonial ventures rather than merely individual flight. Ingolfur Arnason traditionally receives credit for leading first permanent settlement in 874 AD, though archaeological evidence suggests some limited earlier presence. According to later Icelandic accounts, Ingolfur followed traditional Norse practice of allowing fate to select specific settlement location by casting carved wooden pillars overboard and establishing homestead where they washed ashore. Whether historically accurate or retrospective mythologizing, this account captures symbolic significance of Iceland venture as divinely sanctioned new beginning for Norse culture beyond political developments, transforming Scandinavian homeland. Ingolfur's settlement near present-day Reykjavik established pattern for subsequent colonization, spreading around Iceland's limited habitable coastal regions. The land-taking period known as landnam established property patterns that would structure Icelandic society for centuries. This systematic process, lasting approximately 60 years following initial settlement, saw a steady stream of immigrants claiming and developing previously uninhabited territories around Iceland's perimeter. Norse customary law governed this process, with specific requirements for establishing legitimate claims through marking boundaries, building structures, and maintaining active use. The resulting property distribution created society of independent farmsteads rather than nucleated villages typical elsewhere, with geographical constraints limiting development to narrow coastal strip, while Iceland's interior remained largely uninhabitable. This distinctive settlement pattern profoundly influenced subsequent Icelandic social and political development. Establishment of the Althing in 930 AD created what many consider world's oldest parliamentary institution, demonstrating Norse capacity for sophisticated political organization beyond monarchical systems developing in Scandinavia proper. This annual assembly brought representatives from throughout Iceland together for legislative, judicial, and social functions, providing governance structure without centralized executive authority. The Althing combined traditional Norse thing, assembly traditions, with innovations addressing Iceland's unique circumstances, creating a political system where authority derived from law rather than military power. This remarkable institutional development reflected both preservation of traditional Norse values and pragmatic adaptation to new environment where conventional power structures proved impractical. Development of unique democratic Norse society in Iceland represented both conservation and innovation, preserving elements of traditional Scandinavian governance increasingly suppressed in homeland, while adapting these traditions to unprecedented circumstances. Without pre-existing indigenous population or external threats necessitating military hierarchy, Iceland developed a political system emphasizing legal procedure, negotiated settlement, and communal decision-making rather than coercive authority. The resulting society featured complex balance between powerful godar, serving simultaneously as religious, legal, and political leaders, and general population of free farmers, maintaining substantial rights against potential elite dominance. This distinctive political arrangement created functional governance without conventional state structures typical elsewhere in medieval Europe. Women in Iceland enjoyed unprecedented legal rights compared not only to contemporary European societies, but even relative to Scandinavian homeland. Icelandic law granted women property rights, divorce options, and legal autonomy, exceeding Norse traditional practices, which themselves had provided greater female agency than most contemporaneous European systems. This exceptional status stemmed partly from practical necessity in society, where men frequently undertook extended hunting, fishing, or trading expeditions, requiring women to manage households and property independently. Archaeological and literary evidence confirms women exercising substantial authority across various domains, from property management to religious practice. This distinctive gender arrangement represents a significant example of how Norse cultural elements evolved differently in colonial context compared to homeland development. Literary tradition began taking root in Iceland during this period, establishing foundation for remarkable flowering of Old Norse literature that would preserve both Icelandic history and broader Scandinavian cultural heritage. Though written texts would not emerge until subsequent centuries following Christianization, oral composition and transmission of historical accounts, legal traditions, poetry, and mythological material developed sophisticated forms during settlement period. The isolation and conservatism of Icelandic society created ideal conditions for preserving cultural elements, increasingly suppressed elsewhere through Christianization and political centralization. This literary tradition would eventually produce the sagas, Eddas, and other texts constituting our primary sources for understanding not only Icelandic history, but broader Viking Age across Scandinavia. The Iceland venture faced significant challenges despite its eventual success. Limited arable land restricted agricultural production, primarily to animal husbandry, rather than crop cultivation, creating ongoing subsistence challenges. Climate deterioration, beginning late in settlement period, further constrained already marginal agricultural capacity. Absence of indigenous forests required careful management of limited timber resources, while necessitating alternative building materials. Volcanic activity periodically devastated settled regions through eruptions, ashfalls, and subsequent environmental impacts. These environmental constraints required continuous adaptation of traditional Norse livelihood strategies, demonstrating colonists' remarkable resourcefulness while simultaneously limiting population growth and economic development compared to more favorable settlement regions elsewhere. The Icelandic Commonwealth, established through these developments, represented a unique experiment in Norse governance, functioning society without conventional monarchical authority or formal state structures. Political organization centered on complex relationship between approximately 36 godar exercising authority, derived from religious function and law-speaking, rather than territorial control or military power. This system maintained sufficient stability for commerce, dispute resolution, and community functions, while avoiding centralized authority, resembling kingship emerging in Scandinavian homeland and other Norse settlements. The resulting political arrangement, though ultimately proving vulnerable to internal conflict in later centuries, successfully governed Iceland through Viking Age and beyond, demonstrating Norse capacity for institutional innovation beyond traditional leadership models. By century's end, Iceland had transformed from uninhabited wilderness to functioning Norse society, with distinctive characteristics setting it apart from both Scandinavian homeland and other colonial territories. The settlement had proven Viking capacity for planned, sustained colonization of challenging environment far beyond opportunistic raiding or conquest of existing populations. The resulting society preserved traditional Norse elements, increasingly suppressed elsewhere, while developing innovative adaptations to unprecedented circumstances. Most significantly, Iceland established crucial waypoint for subsequent exploration further westward, creating maritime knowledge, navigational expertise, and colonization experience enabling the most ambitious Viking voyages yet to come. The Norse exploration and settlement of Iceland, while remarkable achievement in itself, represented intermediate stage in developing navigational capability that would eventually enable history-altering voyages into unknown western waters. The mastery of open ocean sailing techniques, navigational methods, and maritime survival skills required for Atlantic voyages constituted revolutionary development in human technological achievement. Understanding this maritime expertise reveals how Norse explorers accomplished feats that would remain unmatched for centuries, fundamentally reshaping human understanding of global geography. Open ocean sailing techniques perfected for Atlantic voyages represented quantum leap beyond coastal navigation, familiar to earlier maritime cultures. Unlike Mediterranean or North Sea voyaging, where land remained visible or accessible within reasonable time frame, Atlantic crossings required sustained operation beyond sight of land for days or weeks. This operational environment demanded entirely different approaches to vessel handling, course maintenance, and crisis management. Norse mariners developed sophisticated understanding of weather patterns, current systems, and sailing techniques, enabling effective Western voyages despite technological limitations. Their mastery of square sail handling, particularly sailing close to wind using techniques difficult with this sail configuration, enabled maintenance of desired course rather than merely drifting with prevailing winds and currents. Solar navigation tools developed for northern latitudes allowed position determination despite challenging conditions unique to high-latitude sailing. Archaeological discoveries like the Unatok disk suggest sophisticated understanding of sun's behavior at different latitudes and seasons. Using such instruments, alongside practical knowledge accumulated through generations, Norse navigators could determine approximate latitude through measuring sun's elevation at midday or duration between sunrise and sunset. These methods proved particularly valuable in North Atlantic, where familiar celestial navigation points like Polaris appear at different elevations than in home waters, requiring adjusted techniques. The resulting navigational capability, while less precise than later developments using magnetic compass and astronomical tables, nevertheless enabled consistent course holding sufficient for intercontinental voyaging. Weather prediction developed into sophisticated science through accumulated generational knowledge regarding cloud formations, bird behavior, wave patterns, and atmospheric conditions indicating imminent changes. This predictive capability proved literally life-saving in North Atlantic environment, where sudden storms pose existential threat to vessels unable to reach sheltered waters. Norse maritime culture preserved and transmitted these observational skills through practical apprenticeship rather than formal documentation. creating navigators whose weather sensitivity resulted from lifetime immersion in maritime environment. Contemporary accounts describe captains making decisive course changes based on seemingly insignificant signs incomprehensible to inexperienced observers, demonstrating knowledge depth unattainable through purely theoretical instruction. Ship provisioning for longer journeys created new challenges, requiring innovative solutions beyond techniques adequate for shorter North Sea or Baltic voyages. Water storage presented particular difficulty, with wooden casks subject to contamination during extended storage. Food preservation similarly required careful planning, with dried fish, smoked meat, hardtack bread, and other stable provisions constituting primary shipboard diet. Livestock occasionally transported on longer voyages provided fresh food, but created additional space and care requirements. Successful Atlantic voyaging required carefully calculated balance between adequate provisions and space limitations of vessels primarily designed for other purposes. This logistical expertise proved as crucial to successful exploration as navigational skill or sailing technique. Maritime culture adapted to extreme conditions through both technological innovation and cultural practices, enhancing survival probability in challenging environment. Specialized clothing developed for northern maritime conditions. Waterproof sealskin garments. Layered wool clothing, retaining warmth when wet, protective headgear, created significant advantage over less adapted equipment. Organizational structures aboard ship evolved to maximize efficiency while maintaining morale during extended voyages. Religious practices specific to maritime context, particular prayers before departure, rituals during voyages, thanksgiving ceremonies upon safe arrival, provided psychological framework supporting crews through dangerous undertakings. These cultural adaptations complemented technological developments, creating comprehensive maritime capability transcending merely physical equipment. The mastery of these sophisticated maritime techniques enabled voyages whose ambition and success would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Regular traffic between Norway, Faroe Islands, Iceland, and eventually Greenland created sailing routes across waters previously considered impassable. Trading vessels maintained scheduled services along these routes, transporting goods, settlers, and information between increasingly distant Norse communities. This reliable maritime connection transformed previously isolated North Atlantic islands from dangerous destinations, reachable only by exceptional expeditions, into functioning components of extended Norse world, connected through predictable, if still challenging, sea routes. The normalization of what had recently been extraordinary achievement demonstrates how thoroughly Norse culture had mastered maritime environment previously considered beyond human utilization. The culmination of these navigational developments would eventually enable voyages to North America, representing most ambitious extension of Norse maritime capability. The techniques, equipment, and knowledge systems developed through expanding North Atlantic operations created foundation for these unprecedented westward explorations. Each evolutionary stage, Norway to Shetland, Shetland to Faroes, Faroes to Iceland, Iceland to Greenland, built navigational confidence and expertise, enabling subsequent expansion. This progressive development, rather than sudden revolutionary breakthrough, characterized Norse maritime advancement, with each generation extending operational parameters based on inherited knowledge, while incorporating new observations and techniques from direct experience. The Norse mastery of navigation and seamanship during this period represented one of history's most significant technological achievements, enabling human activity across geographical spaces previously forming absolute barriers to movement. This capability developed not through theoretical breakthroughs or revolutionary inventions, but through generational accumulation of practical knowledge, incremental adaptation of existing techniques, and cultural valuation of maritime expertise. The resulting navigational mastery would not be equaled, much less surpassed, until centuries later, when early modern European exploration began with significantly more advanced technological resources. This Norse maritime revolution fundamentally transformed human relationship with ocean spaces while enabling history-altering exploration beyond previously conceived limits of possible human activity. The expanding arc of Norse exploration reached yet further westward in late 10th century through extraordinary ventures establishing Greenland settlement under leadership of one of history's most colourful Viking figures. Erik Thorvaldsson, known to history as Erik the Red, transformed from problematic outlaw into visionary colonial founder through combination of desperate circumstances, remarkable determination, and entrepreneurial marketing genius. His establishment of Norse settlement on Greenland, despite environmental challenges, stretched Norse colonial capability to its limits, while creating essential stepping stone for subsequent voyages into North American continent. Erik's exile from Iceland for manslaughter forced further westward exploration by removing access to established Norse territories. According to saga accounts, Erik's violent temperament had already forced his family's original relocation from Norway to Iceland following his father's involvement in killings. This pattern repeated in Iceland, where Erik became embroiled in property dispute, escalating to multiple killings, resulting in 3-year exile sentence from Icelandic assembly. This punishment effectively forced exploration of lands rumoured to exist further west, as returning to Norway remained unattractive, while exile terms precluded remaining in Iceland. Personal desperation thus catalyzed geographical discovery, transforming potential disaster into historic opportunity through Erik's characteristic determination to create advantage from adversity. Calculated exploration of Greenland, conducted between 982 to 985 AD, revealed both Erik's practical intelligence and strategic thinking, transcending mere adventure. Rather than haphazard wandering, his 3-year exploratory phase involved systematic survey of Greenland's southwestern coast, identifying most promising agricultural locations, evaluating resource availability, and assessing settlement viability across seasons. This methodical approach reflected sophisticated colonial planning rather than desperate flight, with Erik developing comprehensive understanding of territorial possibilities and limitations. The thoroughness of this survey provided foundation for subsequent successful settlement by identifying specific fjord systems, offering relative environmental advantages within generally challenging Greenland ecosystem. Marketing the Greenland to potential settlers demonstrated Erik's psychological insight and persuasive capabilities beyond mere exploration skills. The deliberate naming choice, emphasizing fertile possibilities rather than accurately describing predominantly ice-covered territory, represents early example of promotional spin designed to attract settlers who might otherwise hesitate relocating to remote Arctic environment. This calculated branding succeeded remarkably well, with substantial colonization fleet assembling upon Erik's return to Iceland following exile completion. The approximately 25 ships departing for Greenland settlement carried estimated 400 to 500 colonists with livestock, equipment, and supplies, representing substantial community relocation rather than merely adventurous individuals. This successful recruitment demonstrated both Erik's personal charisma and Icelandic society's expanding interest in new territorial opportunities, despite acknowledged challenges. establishment of Eastern and Western settlements created Norse colonial presence in environment testing, absolute limits of traditional subsistence patterns. The settlements concentrated in fjord systems where microclimates offered marginally viable conditions for Norse agricultural package, with sheltered valleys providing limited grazing for livestock constituting primary economic foundation. Despite promotional exaggeration, ERIK had accurately identified locations offering greatest settlement potential, demonstrating genuine environmental understanding beneath marketing hyperbole. The resulting colonial pattern featured dispersed farmsteads resembling Icelandic model, but further constrained by environmental limitations, creating precarious subsistence balance requiring continuous adaptation of traditional Norse livelihood practices to increasingly marginal conditions. Challenges of survival in harsh climate required extraordinary adaptability from Norse settlers unused to Arctic conditions. Traditional livestock-based agriculture faced severe constraints from limited grazing season, requiring careful fodder storage and herd management. Timber shortages necessitated alternative construction methods using stone and turf, rather than traditional wood framing. Seasonal sea ice complicated maritime activities central to Norse subsistence, while simultaneously offering new hunting opportunities, focusing on seal and walrus. The isolated location created prolonged supply challenges, requiring careful resource management between infrequent contact with Iceland or Norway. These hardships demanded continuous innovation and adaptation from settler community, stretching Norse cultural practices to their limits while demonstrating remarkable resilience in addressing unprecedented challenges. Adaptation of Norse farming techniques to Arctic conditions revealed both cultural flexibility and limitations when confronting environmental extremes. Settlement archaeological evidence shows progressive shift toward marine resources, with seal and whale hunting assuming greater dietary importance than in traditional Norse subsistence patterns. Livestock management adapted through keeping animals indoors during extended winters, utilizing seaweed supplements when fodder supplies diminished, and adjusting herd composition favoring hardier species. Agricultural focus similarly shifted toward crops demonstrating greater cold tolerance, though overall plant cultivation remained severely constrained. These adaptations demonstrated Norse pragmatism and innovation, while revealing environmental threshold beyond which traditional subsistence patterns proved fundamentally unviable without wholesale adoption of Inuit survival techniques. Cultural transformation settlers proved ultimately unwilling to embrace fully. The Greenland colony successfully established governance institutions, adapting Icelandic models to their unique circumstances. The Greenland Thing provided judicial and legislative functions similar to Icelandic assembly while addressing specific colonial challenges. Property distribution, dispute resolution, and community organization followed familiar Norse patterns modified for local conditions. Christianity arrived relatively early in colony development through missionary efforts sponsored by Norwegian Crown, with substantial church construction demonstrating both religious commitment and available resources during settlement's prosperous early phase. These institutional developments created functioning society, maintaining Norse cultural identity despite geographical isolation and environmental challenges, demonstrating colonists' determination to establish not merely survival outpost, but legitimate extension of Norse civilization. ERIK himself emerged from these developments as colonial leader whose authority derived from practical success rather than formal position. Though never holding official title beyond discoverer and first settler, his influence dominated colony's early development through demonstrated capability, resource control, and personal connections. His farmstead at Brattahlid became settlement's effective capital, hosting Thing meetings, religious ceremonies, and diplomatic functions. His children, particularly son LEIF, would extend family influence through further exploration and leadership within colonial society. This practical authority, based on demonstrated capability rather than formal office, represented characteristic Norse approach to leadership, emphasizing functional effectiveness over theoretical legitimacy or hereditary right. The Greenland venture's success, however qualified by subsequent challenges, represented extraordinary achievement extending Norse colonial reach to geographical limits of agricultural viability. Despite environmental hardships, the settlements survived for approximately 500 years, maintaining Norse cultural identity while developing adaptations addressing unique circumstances. Trade connections with European markets, particularly in walrus ivory and falcons, provided essential external resources sustaining colonial viability beyond mere subsistence. The settlements functioned as legitimate extension of Norse world rather than merely isolated outpost, participating in broader cultural developments including religious conversion, architectural evolution, and political relationships with Norwegian crown claiming nominal sovereignty. Most significantly for subsequent historical development, Greenland settlement established essential base from which further Western exploration would proceed. The colony provided crucial jumping-off point for North American voyages, offering supply base, winter harbor, and institutional support for ventures beyond known territorial limits. Without Greenland settlement providing this intermediate station, sustained exploration of North American coastline would have proven logistically impossible given vessel limitations and supply constraints. Erik's accomplishment thus extended beyond immediate colonial establishment to enabling subsequent discoveries that would fundamentally transform understanding of Western geographical possibilities, while creating first, if ultimately temporary, European presence on North American continent. The inexorable westward progression of Norse exploration reached its culmination through extraordinary voyages, extending European presence onto North American continent for first time in recorded history. Leif Erikson, son of Greenland founder Erik the Red, led expedition around 1000 AD that discovered territories beyond Greenland, establishing temporary settlement at a place called VINLAND. This achievement, occurring nearly 500 years before Columbus, represented pinnacle of Norse exploratory accomplishment, while demonstrating both capabilities and limitations of Viking Age maritime expansion. Understanding these remarkable voyages reveals both triumphant extension of Norse geographical knowledge and ultimate constraints preventing permanent transatlantic European presence. Leif's journey beyond known waters into legend began with voyage apparently intended for Greenland, but blown off course to previously unvisited lands further west. According to saga accounts, Leif had travelled to Norway, where he converted to Christianity before attempting return to Greenland. During this voyage, westerly storms drove his vessel beyond intended destination, resulting in landfall along unfamiliar coastline. This accidental discovery scenario seems plausible given known North Atlantic weather patterns and sailing conditions, though some scholars suggest prior knowledge of Western lands had reached Greenland through earlier accidental voyages or indigenous information. Whether entirely coincidental or building on previous hints, Leif's systematic exploration, following initial discovery, transformed vague awareness into documented geographical knowledge. Discovery of distinct regions receiving specific Norse names demonstrated systematic exploratory approach rather than mere accidental encounter. The Norse identified 3 separate territories along North American coast: Helluland, Flat Stone Land, likely corresponding to Baffin Island characterized by barren rocky landscapes. Markland, forest land, probably representing Labrador with its extensive timber resources, and Vinland, wineland, or possibly meadowland, most likely located in Newfoundland, where more favorable conditions permitted attempted settlement. This methodical categorization reflected sophisticated geographical understanding, distinguishing between territories based on resources, landscape features, and settlement potential, rather than merely noting undifferentiated new land beyond known waters. The Vinland settlement at Lanceau Meadows, conclusively identified through archaeological excavation in the 1960s, provided physical confirmation of saga accounts previously dismissed as legendary by many historians. This site, located at Newfoundland's northern tip, features unmistakable Norse construction, including typical longhouse, ironworking facility, and artifacts definitively linking site to late Viking Age Norse culture. Carbon dating places occupation around 1000 AD, aligning perfectly with saga chronology. The site's discovery transformed understanding of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact from questionable legend to documented historical fact, demonstrating saga literature contained substantial factual information despite literary embellishment. This archaeological vindication of Norse sources suggests other elements of Vinland accounts, though lacking physical confirmation, may contain similar historical basis. First contact with Native Americans, called Skraelings in Norse accounts, established initial European indigenous interaction in North America. According to saga descriptions, these encounters began peacefully with trade exchanges, but deteriorated into conflict through combination of cultural misunderstanding, resource competition, and probable Norse provocations. The indigenous people, likely Beothuk or related groups, initially approached Norse settlement with curiosity and trading interest, but subsequently mobilized substantial numbers against foreign presence. This pattern, initial cautious cooperation followed by escalating conflict, would repeat tragically throughout subsequent European colonization efforts centuries later. The Norse experience represented first instance of fundamental challenge, confronting all European settlement efforts, addressing indigenous population whose territorial claims, resource needs, and cultural perspectives diverged fundamentally from European assumptions. Archaeological evidence of Norse presence in North America provides tantalizingly limited but conclusive proof extending beyond Lanceau Meadows site. Norse artifacts, including distinctive bronze pin, spindle whorl, and iron rivets, confirm Lanceau Meadows' occupation, while suggesting additional temporary sites elsewhere along coast. The settlement's construction, substantial longhouse, separate ironworking building, supporting structures, indicates planned occupation rather than merely emergency shelter during vessel repairs. Evidence suggests occupation, lasting at least one winter and possibly longer, though permanent year-round settlement appears unlikely given limited archaeological accumulation. Recent archaeological work continues identifying potential additional Norse sites, suggesting more extensive presence than previously recognized, though still temporary rather than permanent occupation. Why the settlement ultimately failed involves several interlocking factors, creating insurmountable challenges, despite Vinland's apparent advantages. Conflict with indigenous populations clearly played significant role, with saga accounts describing attacks by numerically superior native forces against vastly outnumbered Norse settlers. Supply line difficulties across vast distances made supporting settlement problematic, particularly when Greenland itself operated near subsistence margins. The limited number of potential settlers available from Greenland's small population restricted colonization possibilities, compared to later European efforts drawing from much larger demographic base. Internal conflicts among Norse leaders further undermined colonization effort, with competing priorities and personal rivalries dividing already limited resources. These factors combined to make sustained settlement unviable, despite Vinland's attractive climate and resources compared to marginal Greenland environment. Resource challenges of maintaining distant colonies ultimately proved decisive limitation on Norse transatlantic expansion. Greenland settlement itself operated near viability threshold, requiring careful resource management and periodic resupply from Iceland or Norway. Extending colonial reach another 1,500 kilometers westward stretched logistical capacity beyond sustainable limits, particularly given vessel technology of period. Unlike later European colonial ventures supported by national resources and commercial networks, Norse expansion relied primarily on family groups and limited commercial backing without institutional support. These resource constraints made maintaining regular contact between Vinland and Greenland problematic, while preventing adequate initial investment necessary for establishing self-sufficient colony capable of withstanding indigenous resistance and environmental challenges. Climate deterioration, beginning gradually in the 11th century, further undermined Vinland's settlement viability and eventually threatened Greenland colony itself. The medieval warm period that had facilitated Norse North Atlantic expansion began gradual reversal toward cooler conditions, with significant implications for maritime activity and agricultural viability throughout region. Increasing sea ice complicated navigation between Greenland and potential North American settlements, making already challenging supply lines increasingly unreliable. Agricultural possibilities diminished as growing seasons shortened, reducing both Greenland's ability to supply potential Western colonies and Vinland's attractiveness as agricultural settlement. These environmental changes, though gradual, progressively undermined expansion model that had succeeded during earlier, more favorable climatic conditions. Stories preserved in Vinland sagas capture both historical reality and mythologized memory of these extraordinary voyages. The two primary accounts, Greenlander's saga and Erik the Red's saga, provide overlapping but distinct narratives of Vinland discovery and exploration. Despite internal contradictions and literary embellishments, these accounts contain verifiable geographical information, confirmed through modern archaeology and environmental study. Their preservation in medieval Icelandic literature, written centuries after described events, demonstrates both cultural significance attached to these voyages and remarkable continuity of Norse oral tradition in transmitting genuine historical information across generations. These texts represent invaluable historical sources, despite requiring careful analysis to distinguish factual core from narrative elaboration. The Vinland venture represented both culmination of Norse exploratory achievement and practical limit of Viking Age expansion capabilities. The successful discovery and temporary settlement of North American territories demonstrated extraordinary maritime skill, exploratory courage, and adaptability, characterizing Norse expansion at its height. The ultimate failure to establish permanent presence equally revealed inherent limitations in Norse colonial model, when stretched beyond sustainable operational parameters. This qualified success, discovery without permanent settlement, established historical precedent that would remain unmatched until technological, institutional, and demographic developments centuries later enabled sustained European transatlantic presence. The Norse achievement in reaching North America 5 centuries before Columbus thus represents both triumphant demonstration of Viking capability and illustration of practical constraints limiting even the most ambitious exploratory cultures within their historical context. The Norse voyages to North America represented simultaneously the pinnacle of Viking Age exploratory achievement and practical limit, beyond which their expansion model could not sustainably extend. Understanding these limitations reveals crucial insights about both Norse capabilities and constraints inherent in their historical context. The ultimate failure to establish permanent transatlantic presence despite successful exploration demonstrates not merely local difficulties with specific settlement attempts, but fundamental thresholds beyond which Viking Age expansion model proved unsustainable regardless of individual leadership or temporary success. Resource challenges of maintaining distant colonies across vast oceanic distances presented insurmountable logistical barriers given Viking Age technological and organizational constraints. Even successful Norse colonies, like Iceland and Greenland, maintained tenuous connections with Scandinavian homeland, their isolation growing with distance and navigational challenges. Supplying settlement yet further westward stretched this already extended network beyond viable limits, particularly when Greenland itself required periodic external support rather than generating surplus capacity. Unlike later European colonial ventures backed by national treasuries, joint stock companies, and substantial population base, Norse expansion relied primarily on family resources, limited commercial investment, and small demographic pool. These constraints created mathematical impossibility for sustaining regular contact across transatlantic distances necessary for viable permanent settlement. Conflict with indigenous populations proved a decisive factor, demonstrating fundamental limitation of Norse expansion model when encountering substantial organized resistance. Previous Norse settlements had generally faced either uninhabited territories or fragmented opposition incapable of sustained resistance. North America presented entirely different equation, with organized indigenous societies possessing substantial population advantage, intimate environmental knowledge, and territorial motivation. The resulting numerical imbalance, small Norse settlement contingents against potentially hundreds or thousands of indigenous defenders, created military mathematics fundamentally different from European conquests, where Norse typically enjoyed tactical, if not always numerical, advantage. This encounter revealed expansion threshold, where Norse military superiority disappeared against unfamiliar opponents in challenging operational environment beyond reliable supply lines. Climate deterioration, beginning in the 11th century, progressively undermined North Atlantic maritime networks, upon which Norse expansion had depended. The medieval warm period, whose favorable conditions had facilitated unprecedented northward and westward voyaging, began gradual reversal toward cooler pattern, eventually culminating in Little Ice Age. Increasing sea ice complicated navigation between established settlements while shortening viable sailing season. Agricultural viability declined throughout North Atlantic territories as growing seasons contracted and marginal areas became completely unsuitable for traditional farming practices. These environmental changes transformed what had been challenging but manageable maritime connections into increasingly hazardous undertakings with diminishing returns, constraining expansion network that had flourished under more favorable climatic regime. Supply line difficulties across vast distances created vulnerability threshold, beyond which settlements became unsustainable, without reliable connection to supporting territories. The North Atlantic crossing between Europe and North America represented significantly greater challenge than shorter hops connecting Scandinavia, British Isles, Iceland, and Greenland. Weather unpredictability, navigational challenges, and sheer distance created substantial probability that vessels would fail to make successful crossing during any given attempt. This unreliability proved manageable for exploratory voyages or occasional trading expeditions, but presented existential threat to settlement, requiring regular resupply during establishment phase before achieving self-sufficiency. The resulting supply uncertainty undermined settlement viability, regardless of local resource availability or initial establishment success. Limited demographic resources available for colonial ventures created recruitment challenges increasing with distance from Scandinavian heartlands. Iceland had required substantial population transfer from Scandinavia, drawing on considerable demographic reservoir. Greenland settlement involved smaller migration from already limited Icelandic population. Vinland represented yet further demographic dilution, attempting to populate settlement from Greenland's few hundred colonists, who themselves needed every available worker for marginal subsistence. This demographic mathematics created unsolvable equation. Successful transatlantic settlement required substantial initial population, ensuring viable gender balance, age distribution, and skill diversity. Yet drawing such numbers from existing colonial territories would undermine their own sustainability. The resulting demographic insufficiency meant even initially, successful settlements remained vulnerable to attrition through conflict, accident, or disease, without adequate replacement capacity. Stories preserved in the Vinland sagas capture both historical reality and mythologized memory of these remarkable ventures, while clearly acknowledging their ultimate limitations. The saga accounts, though sometimes contradictory in detail, consistently present Vinland as desirable territory, whose settlement proved impractical despite multiple attempts. This honest assessment, recorded by culture normally celebrating its achievements rather than acknowledging limitations, suggests clear recognition within Norse society regarding practical expansion boundaries. The matter-of-fact treatment of retreat from Vinland after initial establishment highlights Norse pragmatism regarding colonial viability, rather than stubbornly maintaining unsustainable outposts for prestige or theoretical advantage. This realistic self-assessment regarding expansion limitations represents characteristic Norse pragmatism applied to colonial ventures as to other activities. The constraints encountered during Vinland venture revealed systematic limitations of Norse expansion model, rather than merely circumstantial difficulties with particular settlement attempt. These limitations, demographic insufficiency, logistical strain, indigenous resistance, climatic deterioration, would have affected any Norse transatlantic settlement, regardless of specific location, leadership, or temporary success. The Viking expansion model had reached its operational ceiling, having stretched maritime technology, organizational capacity, and resource networks to absolute limits. Further sustainable expansion would require capabilities beyond Viking Age parameters. Ocean-going vessels capable of reliable transatlantic supply, institutional support transcending family or small commercial backing, demographic resources exceeding Norse colonial territories, and military capacity addressing substantial indigenous resistance. These capabilities would emerge only centuries later during Age of Exploration, enabling sustained European transatlantic presence through fundamentally different colonial model. Norse pragmatic recognition of these limitations demonstrated characteristic cultural resilience and adaptability rather than failure. The abandonment of Vinland, despite its apparent advantages, represented rational resource allocation, decision, rather than defeat, preserving limited colonial resources for maintaining viable settlements, rather than overextending beyond sustainable parameters. This calculated withdrawal prevented potential catastrophic cascade, where failed Vinland settlement might have dangerously depleted Greenland population, potentially undermining that colony's viability as well. The Norse ability to recognize practical limitations, consolidate successful territories rather than pursuing unsustainable expansion, and accurately assess risk-reward equations regarding colonial ventures helps explain their long-term success, establishing sustainable presence across North Atlantic despite harsh conditions and limited resources. The Vinland experience ultimately demonstrated both extraordinary achievement and practical limitation of Norse expansion. Their success reaching North America and accurately assessing its advantages 5 centuries before Columbus represents remarkable exploratory accomplishment, unmatched by any contemporary civilization. Their failure establishing permanent settlement equally illustrated realistic limits, constraining even history's most ambitious maritime culture when operating at extreme range from supporting territories with limited technological and institutional resources. This qualified outcome, discovery without colonization, perfectly captures Viking Age exploration at its most ambitious, reaching beyond existing boundaries through courage and maritime skill, while recognizing practical constraints, limiting permanent expansion beyond sustainable operational parameters. Behind the dramatic narratives of raids, conquests, and explorations that dominate popular understanding of the Viking Age, the fundamental reality of Norse life unfolded through everyday experiences centered on the household. These domestic arrangements, their physical structures, daily routines, gender roles, and familial relationships, constituted the true foundation of Norse society, rather than the more spectacular but exceptional activities that typically command historical attention. Understanding Viking household organization reveals how ordinary Norse people lived, worked, and understood their world throughout this transformative period. Longhouses served as centers of family life, their distinctive architecture reflecting both practical necessity and cultural values defining Norse domestic experience. These elongated rectangular structures typically measured 5 to 7 meters in width, while ranging from 15 to 75 meters in length, depending on household status and regional building traditions. Central hearths provided essential heating and cooking facilities, while smoke holes in roofs offered imperfect ventilation, creating notoriously smoky interior environments that contemporary accounts frequently mentioned. The internal space typically featured central corridor, with raised platforms along walls serving multiple functions, seating during day, sleeping areas at night, and workspaces for various household activities. These efficient, multi-purpose arrangements maximized utility of enclosed space within societies, where building and maintaining substantial structures required significant resource investment. Internal organization within longhouses reflected social hierarchies while facilitating essential household functions. The high seat, occupied by household head, represented literal and symbolic center of domestic authority, its often elaborate decoration and prominent position announcing family status to visitors. Storage areas for food, tools, and valuable possessions occupied carefully considered locations, balancing accessibility against security needs. Work areas for textile production, food preparation, and craft activities typically clustered near light sources from doors or smoke holes. Sleeping arrangements combined pragmatic space utilization with social stratification. Family members typically occupying raised platforms while servants or slaves might sleep near entrances or in less desirable locations. This spatial organization physically embodied social relationships defining household operation, while efficiently accommodating diverse activities necessary for northern survival. Farm life followed seasonal cycles of activity dictated by environmental conditions rather than arbitrary human scheduling. Spring brought intensive agricultural labor, field preparation, planting, livestock birthing, requiring all household members' participation, regardless of age or status. Summer demanded continual attention to crops and animals, while simultaneously allowing fishing, hunting, and resource collections supplementing agricultural production. Autumn focused intensively on harvest activities and food preservation, essential for winter survival. Winter itself, though sometimes portrayed as dormant season, actually featured constant labor, processing materials collected during productive months, manufacturing and repairing tools and clothing, maintaining animals in close confinement necessitated by harsh conditions. This seasonal rhythm structured Norse experience more fundamentally than political events or military campaigns, its predictable cycle providing stability amid other uncertainties. Food preparation and preservation techniques represented essential knowledge, literally determining household survival through long northern winters. Dairy processing created products with varying preservation properties, from short-lived milk to longer-lasting cheese and butter, serving as critical protein sources when fresh food became unavailable. Meat preservation employed multiple methods including smoking, drying, salting, and fermenting, each technique creating products with distinctive storage properties and flavors. Grain processing transformed harvested crops into flour for bread and porridge or facilitated fermentation, producing ale that served as both essential nutrition and valued social lubricant. Fish preservation, particularly important in coastal communities, utilized drying, smoking, and fermentation methods, creating storable products that maintain nutritional value through winter months. These preservation techniques represented sophisticated technological systems, requiring generational knowledge transmission and precise execution rather than merely crude survival methods. Gender roles in daily household management reflected practical division of labor rather than arbitrary discrimination, though clear differentiation existed between typical male and female domains. Women generally controlled interior household operations, food preparation, textile production, childcare, dairy processing, and exercised considerable authority within these spheres, regardless of their formal legal standing. Men typically handled external activities, field work, hunting, fishing, construction, trade expeditions, though considerable overlap existed in many households where all available labor applied to whatever tasks required immediate attention. This practical approach to labor division created complementary, rather than strictly hierarchical relationship between genders, with household success depending on effective execution of both male and female domains. The resulting partnership, though not egalitarian by modern standards, granted Norse women substantial practical authority and respect compared to contemporary cultures elsewhere. Childhood, education, and coming of age followed patterns designed to produce individuals capable of fulfilling essential adult roles within challenging northern environment. Children participated in household labor from earliest ages capable of useful contribution, their responsibilities gradually increasing alongside physical and cognitive development. Education occurred primarily through practical apprenticeship rather than formal instruction, with children learning essential skills by working alongside more experienced household members. Boys typically focused increasingly on male-gendered activities under fathers or other male relatives' guidance, while girls similarly apprenticed in female domains under mothers' direction. Coming of age involved no single dramatic ceremony, but rather progressive assumption of adult responsibilities, with full adult status generally recognized when individual demonstrated capability to contribute as independent household member. This practical educational approach produced individuals with sophisticated skill sets essential for survival, rather than abstract knowledge lacking immediate application. Social relationships within households extended beyond nuclear families to include extended kin, servants, slaves, and occasionally unrelated individuals incorporated through various arrangements. Grandparents often remained integral household members, contributing both labor and invaluable experience while receiving care, when physical capabilities diminished. Unmarried siblings, cousins, or more distant relatives frequently remained incorporated within successful households rather than establishing independent residences. Servants occupied intermediate status between family members and slaves, their treatment varying widely depending on household resources and individual relationships. Slaves, though legally property rather than persons, nevertheless functioned as household members whose treatment ranged from relatively benign to genuinely oppressive, depending on owner temperament and economic circumstances. Foster children, placed temporarily or permanently with households other than birth families, created important social connections between families while distributing childcare responsibilities. These complex household compositions created flexible social units capable of adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining essential productive capacity. Housing architecture varied significantly across Norse territories, reflecting both environmental adaptation and cultural evolution throughout Viking Age. Early Iron Age longhouses in Scandinavia typically featured combined human and animal accommodation under single roof. Practical arrangement facilitating animal care, while animal body heat contributed to human living areas during harsh winters. Later developments increasingly separated human and animal spaces into adjoining structures, maintaining convenient access while reducing sanitation issues inherent in shared accommodation. Urban households in trading centres like Hedeby, York, or Dublin adapted longhouse concepts to constrained town plots, creating narrower structures opening onto streets while maintaining essential internal organisation. Colonial settlements in Atlantic territories, Iceland, Greenland, briefly VINLAND, adapted traditional designs to available building materials, often substituting stone and turf for wood in timber-poor environments. These architectural adaptations demonstrate Norse pragmatism, applying traditional concepts to new circumstances, rather than rigidly maintaining impractical building forms when conditions changed. Household economics operated primarily as subsistence systems focused on self-sufficiency rather than market production, though considerable variation existed depending on location and social status. Most households aimed to produce majority of their essential requirements: food, clothing, tools, shelter, internally or through direct exchange with neighbors rather than market transactions. Specialized production, creating genuine surplus for trade, remained relatively uncommon, except in particular circumstances or locations, specifically oriented toward commercial activity. Even wealthy households with significant trade connections maintained substantial direct production rather than relying primarily on purchased goods. This self-sufficiency orientation stemmed partly from practical necessity in societies with limited market development and partly from cultural values emphasizing household autonomy and productive capability. The resulting economic organization created resilient social units capable of surviving periodic trade disruptions or political instability through internal productive capacity. Daily rhythms within Norse households balanced continuous labor requirements against human needs for rest, socialization, and meaning beyond mere survival activities. Work generally began at dawn and continued until dusk, though winter darkness in northern latitudes necessarily shortened active periods regardless of human preference. Meals typically occurred twice daily, morning breaking fast and evening main meal, though work breaks with light food might occur midday during particularly demanding seasons. Evening hours after main meal often featured storytelling, music, game playing, or other social activities, building community bonds while transmitting cultural knowledge between generations. These daily patterns created integrated experience where work, family relationships, cultural transmission, religious observance, and recreation blended together rather than occupying sharply differentiated domains as in modern life. The resulting holistic lifestyle, though materially constrained by modern standards, offered psychological coherence, often lacking in more compartmentalized modern existence. The Norse household ultimately represented not merely dwelling place, but fundamental social institution, integrating economic production, cultural transmission, religious practice, education, and security within single organizational structure. Unlike modern arrangements separating these functions across multiple institutions, Viking Age households combined them within coherent system, where family relationships simultaneously structured economic activity, social identity, religious practice, and political allegiance. This integrated household system provided remarkable resilience against environmental challenges and political disruptions, while efficiently utilizing limited resources available in challenging northern environments. Understanding its operation reveals Norse society not merely as a collection of raiders and explorers, but as sophisticated adaptation to demanding conditions, capable of both maintaining traditional lifeways and flexibly incorporating innovations when circumstances demanded evolution rather than rigid traditionalism. The religious dimension of Norse life extended far beyond the dramatic mythology that has captured modern imagination, permeating everyday existence through practical rituals, spiritual specialists, and material expressions of cosmic understanding. While tales of gods and giants provided narrative framework explaining world's nature and origin, ordinary Norse people experienced their spiritual tradition primarily through regular practices integrated with agricultural cycles, life transitions, and community gatherings. Understanding this lived religious experience reveals Norse spirituality as a sophisticated system addressing practical human needs while connecting individuals to larger cosmic order through tangible ritual rather than merely abstract theology. Religious practices beyond mythology encompassed everyday beliefs informing routine decisions and activities, rather than being reserved for special occasions. Before Christianity gradually displaced indigenous traditions, Norse spiritual understanding shaped approaches to childbirth, illness, travel, construction, and countless other ordinary activities. Houseposts might receive offerings, ensuring structural stability and household prosperity. Fields underwent rituals promoting fertility before planting and successful harvest after growth. Travelers performed specific practices before journeys, seeking protection against hazards. These everyday observances, though less dramatic than major community ceremonies, actually constituted majority of Norse religious experience, integrated thoroughly with practical activities, rather than separated into distinct religious domain, contrasted with secular life. Blot sacrifices marking seasonal changes represented communities' most significant religious ceremonies, connecting human activity with cosmic cycles, while redistributing resources through ritualized sharing. These ceremonies typically centered on animal sacrifice, with blood ritually collected and sprinkled upon participants, sacred spaces, and images representing divine powers. The sacrificial meat subsequently became feast shared among participants, creating communal meal symbolically connecting human and divine realms, while practically redistributing protein resources throughout community. Major blots marked critical seasonal transitions: winter beginning, midwinter, spring arrival, midsummer, when community needed divine assistance, ensuring successful transition between activity phases. These ceremonies combined religious significance with practical social functions, reinforcing community bonds, redistributing resources, establishing hierarchies, and coordinating seasonal activities through commonly recognized temporal markers. Cider magic and women's shamanic practices constituted sophisticated spiritual technology, addressing specific community needs through specialized practitioners. This distinctive tradition, primarily though not exclusively practiced by women, involved altered consciousness states achieved through various techniques, including chanting, psychoactive substances, sleep deprivation, or sensory manipulation. Practitioners supposedly gained ability to see future events, communicate with non-human entities, influence weather, heal illnesses, or harm enemies through these techniques. Archaeological evidence supporting these practices includes distinctive staffs associated with cider practitioners in female graves, alongside unusual objects likely serving ritual rather than practical functions. Historical sources describe cider practitioners occupying ambiguous social position, respected for their abilities, yet sometimes feared for their uncanny powers transcending normal human limitations. This magical tradition represented sophisticated psychological technology, addressing anxieties and needs beyond ordinary human capability, while providing framework for understanding misfortune when conventional explanations proved inadequate. Burial customs reflected beliefs about afterlife, while simultaneously making statements about deceased's social position and family status. Norse funerary practices demonstrated remarkable diversity rather than standardized approach, suggesting regional variations and evolutionary changes throughout Viking Age. Cremation, common in early period, gradually gave way to inhumation, though both practices coexisted throughout most of era. Grave goods, weapons, tools, jewelry, food, drinking vessels appeared in varying quantities, depending on deceased's status and local customs. Some high-status individuals received elaborate ship burials, most famously at Oseberg and Gokstad, where actual vessels became tombs containing extraordinary wealth alongside deceased. More typical burials ranged from simple inhumations with minimal goods to modest boat-shaped stone settings symbolically referencing maritime journey to afterlife. This diversity suggests complex understanding of death's meaning, rather than simplistic uniform conception of afterlife journey. Rune stones commemorating the dead and marking territory combined practical communication, artistic expression, and religious significance within single medium. These distinctive monuments featured inscriptions using runic alphabet, alongside decorative elements often incorporating complex animal designs or Christian symbols in later examples. Their texts typically followed formulaic patterns, naming commissioner, commemorated individual, relationship between them, and sometimes circumstances of death or commissioner's status claims. Beyond communicating specific information, these monuments served multiple functions simultaneously, marking territorial claims, demonstrating family prosperity through conspicuous expenditure, ensuring commemorated individuals' continued social presence despite physical death, and manifesting religious concepts through symbolic imagery. Their placement at boundaries, crossroads, bridges, or other transitional locations further emphasized their role mediating between different states, life and death, one territory and another, human and divine realms. Archaeological evidence reveals household religious practices focusing on maintaining boundaries between controlled domestic space and external forces potentially threatening family welfare. Buried offerings beneath house foundations, protective symbols carved on doorposts, and amulets incorporated into structural elements all appear consistently in Norse archaeological contexts. These practices suggest sophisticated understanding of household as both physical and spiritual entity, requiring regular maintenance of boundaries between safe interior space and potentially dangerous external forces. Similar boundary maintenance appears in personal protective devices, amulets worn on body, Thor's hammers, arm rings with protective functions, creating portable sacred space around individual when venturing beyond household protection. These practices demonstrate religious thinking, extending beyond formal ceremonies to encompass continuous maintenance of proper relationships between human, natural, and supernatural domains through material practices rather than merely abstract belief. Conversion to Christianity introduced fundamental reorganization of Norse religious understanding and practice, though process occurred gradually, with significant regional variations rather than sudden transformation. Early Christian influence appeared through grave goods, showing mixed religious symbolism, crosses alongside traditional Norse items, suggesting individuals hedging spiritual bets rather than making exclusive religious commitment. Formal conversion often followed practical political calculations by leaders recognizing advantages from alliance with Christian kingdoms rather than genuine theological conviction. Archaeological evidence reveals numerous churches built directly atop former pagan sacred sites, indicating both practical reuse of established gathering locations and deliberate symbolic statement about new religion superseding old traditions. Despite official conversion, many traditional practices continued under thin Christian veneer, with seasonal celebrations maintaining ancient timing, while nominally honoring Christian saints rather than Norse deities. This complex negotiation between religious systems created distinctive Scandinavian Christianity, maintaining significant indigenous elements despite nominal doctrinal orthodoxy. Landscape features, including sacred groves, stones, mountains, waterfalls, and other natural formations, constituted essential elements of Norse religious topography. Historical sources mention specific locations where gods reportedly manifested or particular powers could be accessed through appropriate ritual activities. Archaeological evidence confirms concentrated ritual activity at distinctive landscape features, suggesting these locations served as natural temples where divine presence seemed particularly accessible. Large communal religious centers at Uppsala, Ledra, and other locations featured both natural elements and human constructions, creating complex sacred landscapes rather than merely isolated temples. This integration of natural features within religious understanding created spirituality thoroughly embedded within physical world, rather than positing sharp division between supernatural and natural realms. The resulting religious landscape encouraged perception of divine presence within ordinary environment, rather than isolating sacred experience to specialized structures separated from daily life. Personal religious experience for ordinary Norse individuals likely focused more on immediate ancestors and local spirits than distant cosmic deities dominating mythological narratives. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests household worship centered particularly on family predecessors, believed to remain active in supporting descendants' welfare if properly honored through offerings and remembrance. Local landscape spirits, sometimes called landvetter, similarly received regular attention through offerings at specific locations within territory utilized by community. These more immediate spiritual relationships addressed practical concerns like weather, fertility, health, and protection against misfortune through entities directly connected to specific households or locations, rather than remote cosmic powers. The resulting religious experience emphasized reciprocal relationships, humans providing offerings and acknowledgement, while spiritual entities offered protection and assistance, rather than mere submission to overwhelmingly powerful deities demanding worship without practical return benefits. The archaeological record reveals considerable investment in physical representations of spiritual concepts, contradicting earlier scholarly assumptions about aniconic Norse religion lacking material expressions. Numerous small figurines representing deities or supernatural beings appear in settlement contexts, suggesting household shrines featuring tangible divine representations. Larger wooden figures mentioned in historical sources have rarely survived due to material perishability, though occasional discoveries confirm their historical existence. Pendants shaped as miniature Thor's hammers, Freya's boars, or Odin's symbols provided portable divine protection while simultaneously signaling religious affiliation. This material dimension of Norse religion facilitated tangible interaction with otherwise abstract spiritual forces, allowing physical engagement through offerings, decoration, or ritual manipulation of objects embodying divine presence. The resulting religious experience engaged multiple senses: touch, sight, smell, taste, hearing, rather than relying primarily on abstract theological concepts requiring intellectual comprehension. The gradual Christian conversion process fundamentally transformed Norse spiritual experience by replacing indigenous polytheistic framework, emphasizing practical reciprocity, with monotheistic system emphasizing salvation, sin, and submission to divine authority, mediated through ecclesiastical hierarchy. This revolutionary change altered not merely specific beliefs, but entire framework structuring relationship between humans and divine realm. Traditional practices, maintaining reciprocal relationships with multiple divine powers, gradually gave way to worship focused exclusively on single deity, approached through standardized liturgy, administered by specialized priesthood. Seasonal ceremonies, previously marking agricultural cycles, increasingly yielded to Christian calendar, emphasizing historical events in Christ's life, disconnected from local environmental patterns. Despite these fundamental changes, many traditional practices persisted through incorporation into Christian framework. Sacred sites repurposed as church locations, seasonal celebrations reframed as saints' days, protective magic reconceived as prayer, creating distinctive Scandinavian Christianity, rather than merely replicated Southern European religious forms. Norse spiritual understanding ultimately represented sophisticated system addressing universal human needs through frameworks specifically adapted to northern environmental conditions and social structures. Rather than primitive superstition, eventually displaced by superior religion, indigenous Norse practices constituted complex system, effectively addressing psychological, social, and practical requirements through integrated belief and ritual. The religious dimension permeated everyday existence rather than occupying separate domain, with spiritual practices thoroughly embedded within practical activities rather than isolated from ordinary experience. Understanding this integrated spiritual approach reveals Norse culture's sophisticated adaptation to challenging environment through systems addressing both material needs and psychological well-being, through practices connecting individuals to community, ancestors, landscape, and cosmic order, through tangible ritual rather than merely abstract theology. Alongside practical technologies ensuring physical survival, Norse society developed sophisticated artistic traditions, expressing cultural values, historical memory, and aesthetic sensibilities through various media. These creative expressions, verbal, visual, and material, transcended mere decoration to communicate complex meanings while simultaneously enhancing everyday objects with beauty, elevating mundane experience. Understanding Norse artistic achievements reveals culture, possessing rich, expressive traditions, despite challenging environment that might seem to preclude attention to aesthetic concerns beyond basic survival requirements. Skaldic poetry preserved history and honored leaders through highly formalized verbal art demanding extraordinary technical skill from practitioners. This distinctive poetic tradition featured complex metrical patterns, elaborate kennings substituting metaphorical phrases for ordinary terms, and intricate alliteration schemes creating sophisticated verbal compositions transmitted orally before eventually being recorded in written form centuries later. Professional skalds attached to royal or noble households composed these works celebrating patrons' achievements, commemorating battles, or preserving significant events for future generations. The resulting poems functioned simultaneously as entertainment, historical record, political propaganda, and artistic achievement, judged by demanding aesthetic standards. Their preservation through centuries of oral transmission before eventual written recording demonstrates cultural value attached to verbal artistry despite absence of writing technology during pagan era. Material artistry through metalwork and wood-carving traditions created objects combining practical function with extraordinary aesthetic refinement. Metal items, jewelry, weapons, belt fittings, vessels, frequently featured elaborate decoration, far exceeding functional requirements, demonstrating importance attached to beauty beyond mere utility. Wood carving similarly transformed utilitarian objects, furniture, buildings, vessels, tools, into artistic expressions through decorative elements, ranging from simple geometric patterns to complex figural representations. Archaeological discoveries continue revealing remarkable technical sophistication in these craft traditions, with microscopic examination showing precision details invisible to naked eye, yet meticulously executed by craftspeople working without modern magnification tools. This dedication to excellence, even in details unlikely to receive conscious notice, reveals culture valuing artistic integrity and technical mastery as worthy goals, transcending mere practical adequacy. The aesthetic of interlace and animal forms characterized Norse visual expression across various media, creating distinctive stylistic tradition, recognizable despite regional variations and evolutionary development throughout Viking Age. This design approach featured complex patterns where lines weave over and under each other while transforming into animal bodies that themselves intertwine in elaborate compositions. Animals depicted in these designs, wolves, serpents, birds, dragons, often appear partially transformed or combined with other creatures, creating ambiguous entities existing between categories, rather than representing naturalistic depictions. The resulting visual complexity rewards extended contemplation, revealing additional details and relationships upon careful examination, rather than surrendering all meaning at first glance. This aesthetic preference suggests cultural value attached to complexity, transformation, and boundary crossing, rather than rigid categorization or simplified representation. Music, instruments, and performance in Norse society remain less documented than visual arts due to perishability of instruments and absence of musical notation system. Yet archaeological and textual evidence confirms sophisticated musical tradition. Instrument discoveries include lyres, flutes, whistles, and horn instruments capable of producing complex melodies rather than merely simple signals. Historical descriptions mention music accompanying various activities: feasts, religious ceremonies, work coordination, battle preparation, suggesting diverse musical traditions serving different social functions. Textual sources describe individuals gaining fame and patronage through musical skill, indicating professional specialization beyond casual amateur practice. While specific melodies and performance techniques remain largely unrecoverable, available evidence suggests music held significant cultural value, both as entertainment and as essential component of religious and social ceremonies throughout Norse society. The oral tradition of sagas binding communities together represents perhaps most significant Norse artistic achievement, creating vast narrative corpus preserving historical memory, cultural values, and entertainment simultaneously. These prose narratives, composed and transmitted orally for centuries before eventual written recording, range from relatively straightforward historical accounts to complex narratives blending historical events with legendary and supernatural elements. Their sophisticated narrative techniques, complex chronology, psychological insight, multiple perspective, dramatic irony, demonstrate literary sophistication despite oral composition and transmission. The corpus includes diverse subgenres, including family sagas, focusing on Icelandic settlers and their descendants, legendary sagas incorporating mythical elements, and kings' sagas recording royal histories. This narrative tradition served multiple functions: entertainment during long winter evenings, preservation of historical knowledge, transmission of cultural values, establishment of legal precedents, while simultaneously achieving genuine artistic excellence judged by sophisticated aesthetic standards. Textiles represented significant, though frequently overlooked, artistic medium, with archaeological discoveries revealing remarkable technical sophistication and aesthetic refinement in Norse fabric production. Surviving fragments show complex weaving patterns, skilled dyeing using various plant materials to achieve rich color palette, and elaborate decorative elements including tablet-woven bands with intricate designs. Historical sources mention textiles specifically praised for beauty and given as valuable gifts, indicating cultural recognition of fabric production as genuine artistic achievement rather than merely utilitarian craft. The gender dimension proves particularly significant, as textile production remained primarily female domain, making this art form central vehicle for women's artistic expression throughout Norse society. The resulting textile tradition combined practical necessity with artistic achievement, transforming essential survival requirement into opportunity for creative expression and technical excellence. Architectural decoration transformed buildings from mere practical shelters into artistic expressions, conveying status, taste, and cultural affiliations. Carved doorposts, decorative gables, painted interior elements, and sculptural details enhanced structures, while communicating symbolic messages about occupants. Archaeological evidence from high-status sites reveals color was widely used in architectural contexts, contradicting popular image of austere unpainted wooden structures. Ships similarly received decorative treatment beyond functional requirements, with carved prows, painted hulls, and decorative elements transforming vessels into floating artistic statements. These architectural and naval embellishments demonstrate Norse willingness to invest significant resources enhancing everyday environment through artistic expression, indicating cultural valuation of beauty within daily experience rather than restricting aesthetic considerations to specialized contexts separated from ordinary life. Artistic production occurred within complex social contexts, rather than resulting from isolated individual creativity, divorced from community standards and requirements. Professional specialists, woodcarvers, metalworkers, textile artists, poets, musicians, typically trained through extended apprenticeship within established traditions, setting technical standards while allowing individual innovation within recognized parameters. Patrons commissioning works exercised considerable influence over content and sometimes form, particularly regarding commemorative or status-displaying pieces intended for public presentation. Community judgment established reputations through collective assessment of technical execution, aesthetic appeal, and appropriate content conforming to cultural expectations. This social embeddedness created artistic tradition, balancing innovation with continuity, allowing stylistic evolution while maintaining recognizable cultural expression across generations and diverse geographic locations throughout Norse world. Religion and art maintained intimate connection throughout pagan era, with artistic expression frequently serving religious functions, while religious concepts provided content for artistic representation. Amulets, ritual objects, and divine images received particularly careful artistic attention, their aesthetic refinement serving spiritual purpose beyond mere decoration. Sacred spaces featured architectural and decorative elements, enhancing religious experience through visual impact and symbolic communication. Certain artistic motifs, specific animal combinations, particular patterns, specialized symbols, carried religious meanings alongside aesthetic value, allowing objects to communicate spiritual concepts through visual language, understood by cultural participants. This integration between religious and artistic domains created situation where aesthetic excellence served spiritual purpose, while religious concepts provided meaningful content for artistic expression, each domain enhancing rather than competing with the other. The arrival of Christianity introduced revolutionary changes to Norse artistic traditions, introducing new motifs, techniques, and aesthetic values, while gradually displacing indigenous artistic expressions associated with pagan religious concepts. Stone carving techniques brought by Christian craftsmen transformed monumental expression from predominantly wooden medium to more durable stone execution. Manuscript illumination introduced new artistic possibilities previously unavailable in predominantly oral culture. Architectural forms developed for church construction gradually influenced secular building decoration. Despite these fundamental changes, distinctive Norse aesthetic sensibilities persisted through adaptation rather than wholesale replacement, creating unique Scandinavian interpretations of Christian artistic conventions rather than merely replicating Southern European models. The resulting synthesis maintained continuity with indigenous tradition while incorporating new elements, demonstrating Norse cultural resilience through artistic adaptation rather than rigid traditionalism incapable of evolution. Norse artistic expression ultimately represented sophisticated cultural achievement, balancing aesthetic refinement with practical function, technical excellence with meaningful content, and traditional continuity with individual creativity. These artistic traditions transformed everyday experience by enhancing ordinary objects through beauty and meaning, beyond mere utility, creating an environment where aesthetic considerations permeated daily life, rather than remaining segregated within specialized artistic contexts. Understanding these expressive traditions reveals Norse culture's remarkable capacity for creating beauty and meaning within challenging environment where survival concerns might seem to preclude attention to aesthetic refinement. This artistic sophistication directly contradicts stereotypical portrayal of Vikings as crude barbarians concerned solely with violence and plunder. revealing instead complex culture, valuing creative expression alongside practical capability with an integrated worldview where beauty and function enhanced rather than opposed each other. Norse society developed sophisticated systems maintaining social order through combination of formal legal procedures, community enforcement mechanisms, and shared cultural values rather than centralized authority or permanent enforcement institutions. Understanding these social regulatory systems reveals how Viking communities maintained functional order, despite limited formal governance structures and absence of professional enforcement mechanisms characteristic of more centralized contemporaneous societies elsewhere in Europe. Thing assemblies served as centers of democratic process, providing forums where free men gathered periodically to resolve disputes, establish community standards, and participate in governance decisions affecting their collective welfare. These gatherings, occurring at established locations on regular schedule, represented most formal governance institution in pre-state Norse society. Local things handled routine matters within specific communities, while regional assemblies addressed broader concerns affecting multiple settlements. The Icelandic Althing represented most fully developed version of this institution, though similar assemblies operated throughout Norse territories. Participation rights typically extended to free male landholders, though influence varied according to wealth, family connections, and personal reputation rather than strictly egalitarian access. While certainly not meeting modern democratic standards regarding universal participation, these assemblies nevertheless provided genuine governance forums where community members directly influenced decisions rather than merely receiving pronouncements from distant authorities. The law speaker's crucial role in pre-literate society demonstrated Norse innovation, addressing governance needs through institutional adaptation to technological limitations. Without written legal codes available for reference, these specialized officials memorized entire body of community law, reciting relevant sections during thing assemblies when specific provisions required application to particular cases. This remarkable feat of memorization required extraordinary cognitive ability and dedicated training, creating specialized profession, preserving legal continuity through generations. Law speakers typically recited entire legal code during major thing gatherings, ensuring both transmission accuracy and community familiarity with governing provisions. Their authority derived from accurate knowledge demonstration rather than coercive power, emphasizing Norse governance emphasis on procedural legitimacy rather than mere force application. This institutional adaptation effectively addressed the challenge of maintaining legal consistency within pre-literate society, demonstrating Norse capacity for sophisticated governance innovation despite technological limitations. Blood feuds and complex compensation systems created accountability mechanisms enforcing social norms despite absence of centralized authority or professional enforcement institutions. When individuals suffered wrongs, ranging from property damage to homicide, their kin bore responsibility for seeking appropriate redress, either through compensation negotiation or, if necessary, proportional retaliation. This collective responsibility created powerful deterrent against antisocial behavior, as potential wrongdoers recognized their actions would generate consequences affecting not merely themselves, but their entire kinship network. Compensation systems provided alternative to endless violent retaliation by establishing standardized payments appropriate for various offenses, allowing restoration of social balance through material transfer rather than exclusively through vengeance. These systems demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology by acknowledging both desire for revenge and practical benefits from peaceful resolution. creating effective regulation systems without requiring centralized enforcement mechanisms beyond reach of Norse political development during this period. Slavery in Norse society created distinctive status category, defined by specific legal provisions, social expectations, and economic functions. Unlike later plantation slavery systems, Norse thralls typically lived integrated within household, alongside free members, performing similar work under obviously disadvantaged conditions, rather than being segregated into separate productive units. Legal provisions specified thralls' status as property rather than persons, though some protection against wanton destruction existed through compensation requirements to owners if others harmed their human property. Acquisition occurred primarily through capture during raids or warfare, though children born to enslaved mothers inherited unfree status. Manumission remained possible through various mechanisms, including self-purchase, owner's voluntary release, or exceptional service-earning freedom grant. Archaeological evidence regarding slave treatment suggests considerable variation, with some burials indicating decent treatment, while others show physical evidence of hardship and abuse. This institution, while obviously contradicting modern ethical standards, functioned as an integral component of Norse economic and social system throughout Viking Age, before gradually diminishing through combination of Christian ethical influence and changing economic conditions, making slavery less advantageous compared to other labor arrangements. Honor culture and its consequences for daily interactions created informal but powerful regulatory system, shaping behavior through reputation management rather than formal punishment mechanisms. Within Norse society, personal reputation, combining assessments of courage, reliability, generosity, and skill, constituted essential social currency, determining everything from marriage opportunities to trading partnerships to political influence. Community judgment continuously evaluated individual conduct against cultural standards, with resulting reputation adjustments creating powerful incentives for norm compliance more effective than formal punishment threats. Public insults or disrespect required active response restoring honor through appropriate counteraction, ranging from verbal retort to physical confrontation, depending on offense severity. This honor system simultaneously promoted social stability through predictable behavior standards, while potentially generating instability through escalating conflict cycles when honor demands created incompatible obligations. The resulting social dynamic created environment where informal community judgment regulated behavior more effectively than formal institutions could have accomplished, given Norse political development level during this period. Legal codes, initially preserved orally before eventual written recording, revealed sophisticated understanding of social regulation, addressing diverse situations through case precedent rather than abstract principle. Norse law typically approached infractions through specific case categories with established responses, rather than applying general principles to novel situations. Compensation schedules specified precise payments for various injuries, different amounts for different fingers, specific values for various degrees of wounding, creating predictable response expectations. Procedural requirements received particular attention, with case validity often depending on proper sequence and form, rather than merely substantive merit. This emphasis on procedure, rather than exclusively outcome, reflected society valuing predictable process over potentially arbitrary judgment, even if occasionally producing results seemingly unfair by modern standards. The resulting legal tradition balanced flexibility, addressing new situations against consistency, ensuring similar cases received similar treatment across time, creating effective regulation system despite absence of professional legal class or centralized enforcement mechanisms. Property concepts in Norse society combined individual rights with community interests through distinctive arrangements, balancing exclusive control against collective welfare considerations. Land ownership typically involved both individual usage rights and community obligations, with ownership entailing responsibilities alongside privileges. Grazing lands often featured mixed usage patterns, where individual owners maintained certain rights, while community members retained access for specific purposes or during particular seasons. Water rights, fishing access, and forest usage similarly balanced individual claims against community needs through complex arrangements, neither fully private nor completely communal. These sophisticated property concepts created flexible systems, addressing both individual incentives for resource development and community requirements for sustainable usage, demonstrating Norse capacity for nuanced institutional arrangements beyond simple dichotomy between private and communal property regimes characterized in some historical analyses. Dispute resolution mechanisms emphasized restoration of social harmony, rather than abstract justice concepts or punishment for its own sake. When conflicts arose, community pressure typically favored negotiated settlements, restoring functional relationships, rather than vindication of abstract principles, regardless of practical consequences. Third-party mediation played a crucial role, with respected community members facilitating agreement between conflicting parties. Through combination of moral authority, practical suggestion, and social pressure, public opinion functioned as powerful enforcement mechanism, with community approval or disapproval influencing disputants' willingness to accept reasonable settlements, rather than pursuing maximalist positions regardless of social cost. This pragmatic approach, prioritizing restored social function over abstract justice or comprehensive vindication, created conflict resolution system remarkably effective at maintaining community viability, despite inevitable disputes arising within any human group. The resulting social order emphasized practical cooperation, despite interpersonal disagreements, rather than requiring perfect justice or complete agreement before functional relationships could continue. The transition from traditional Norse legal systems toward increasingly centralized royal authority occurred gradually throughout Viking Age, with significant regional variations reflecting different political development trajectories. In Denmark and Norway, strengthening monarchies gradually appropriated legal authority previously exercised through community things, claiming exclusive right to authorize legitimate violence while criminalizing traditional self-help mechanisms like blood feud. Royal officials increasingly supplanted community judgment in dispute resolution, creating professional governance layer between ordinary people and legal processes. Written law codes under royal authority replaced oral tradition maintained by law speakers, transferring legal knowledge control from community representatives to royal administrators. This transformation occurred unevenly across Norse world, with Iceland maintaining traditional, thing-centered governance far longer than Scandinavian homeland territories, experiencing earlier royal consolidation. The resulting governance diversity across Norse cultural sphere demonstrates how shared cultural traditions could produce different institutional arrangements, depending on specific historical circumstances, rather than following single predetermined developmental trajectory. These sophisticated social regulatory systems ultimately maintained functional order within Norse communities, despite limited formal governance structures compared to contemporaneous societies elsewhere. Through combination of community assemblies, kinship enforcement mechanisms, honor culture, and pragmatic dispute resolution approaches, Norse society achieved remarkable self-regulation without requiring extensive bureaucracy professional enforcement class, or centralized authority characteristic of state-level societies. Understanding these governance achievements reveals Norse culture's sophisticated institutional development, addressing practical regulatory needs through arrangements suited to their specific technological, environmental, and cultural context, rather than merely representing primitive precursors to more advanced governance forms. These systems demonstrated Norse pragmatism, creating functional solutions to universal human challenges through distinctive institutional arrangements, reflecting particular historical and cultural circumstances, rather than following external development models inappropriate to their specific situation. The intersection of law and religion created distinctive enforcement mechanisms within Norse society before Christianity's arrival. Oaths sworn on sacred objects, rings dedicated to gods, weapons symbolizing divine power, or other items believed to connect human and divine realms, carried supernatural consequences for violation beyond mere social disapproval. Breaking such oaths supposedly brought divine punishment, regardless of whether human authorities discovered the transgression, creating an accountability system functioning even without witnesses or formal evidence. Temple sanctuaries served as neutral ground, where even enemies could gather under religious protection, facilitating negotiations otherwise impossible given existing hostilities. Religious specialists sometimes participated in dispute resolution, lending spiritual authority to settlements while ensuring cosmic as well as social harmony through appropriate resolution. This religious dimension strengthened legal systems that might otherwise have seemed merely advisory, given limited coercive enforcement capacity within pre-state Norse society. Geographic isolation shaped distinctive legal evolution within different Norse communities, despite shared cultural foundation. Iceland's unique circumstances, settlement by diverse groups from various Norwegian regions, absence of pre-existing power structures, limited resources requiring cooperation, produced particularly sophisticated legal system, balancing practical dispute resolution against limited enforcement capacity. The Icelandic Commonwealth created governance system functioning without executive authority, relying instead on community pressure and procedure legitimacy rather than coercive enforcement. Greenland settlers adapted Icelandic models to even more constrained circumstances, creating further specialized arrangements addressing extreme isolation and limited population. Colonial territories within British Isles and Normandy developed hybrid legal systems incorporating elements from both Norse tradition and indigenous arrangements found in conquered territories. This regional diversification demonstrated how shared Norse legal concepts could produce different specific implementations when interacting with varying environmental, demographic, and political circumstances. Law and social position maintained complex relationship throughout Norse society, with status influencing legal standing, while legal rights partially defined social categories. Free farmers, bondi, formed society's foundation, possessing full legal rights with compensations and protections, corresponding to their status as independent householders. Jarls and other elite figures received higher compensation values for injuries or death, reflecting their elevated social position through concrete legal terms rather than merely abstract status. Freed slaves, leisingi, occupied intermediate position, legally free but carrying certain disabilities and obligations toward former owners for specific time period, before achieving full legal equality with freeborn individuals. Women's legal standing varied by marital status and regional custom, with widows typically enjoying greater legal autonomy than married women. though all maintained certain rights regarding property, divorce, and physical protection, regardless of marital status. This legal differentiation created society where rights and protections scaled with social position rather than applying uniformly across population, yet maintained basic protections even for disadvantaged groups, unlike more severely stratified contemporary societies elsewhere. Judicial procedures emphasized public performance and community witnessing rather than private deliberation or professional judgment. Cases brought before things required formal presentation, following prescribed verbal formulas and procedural sequences, with deviation potentially invalidating otherwise legitimate claims regardless of substantive merit. Witness testimony carried extraordinary importance, with reputation determining credibility more than specific evidence presented. Ordeals occasionally resolved particularly difficult cases through procedural mechanisms believed to reveal divine judgment, handling hot iron, retrieving objects from boiling water, or other tests supposedly revealing guilt or innocence through supernatural intervention rather than human assessment. These public performances served educational function beyond specific case resolution, demonstrating legal norms and procedures to assembled community while reinforcing collective values through visible enforcement. The resulting legal culture emphasized procedural correctness, community involvement, and transparent resolution, rather than abstract justice concepts or private determination. The evolution from self-help enforcement toward institutional justice occurred gradually throughout Viking Age, with different regions following varied trajectories at different rates. Earlier periods featured greater reliance on kinship groups enforcing rights through direct action, seizing compensation, conducting approved vengeance, or otherwise addressing wrongs through family capacity rather than formal institutional mechanisms. As political consolidation progressed, emerging royal authorities increasingly claimed exclusive legitimate violence right, criminalizing traditional self-help mechanisms, while establishing official enforcement systems operated under royal authority. This transition created tension between traditional expectations regarding appropriate responses to wrongs and emerging royal prohibitions against actions previously considered legitimate. The resulting hybrid systems featured official procedures increasingly handling routine matters, while traditional mechanisms continued addressing situations where official response proved inadequate, unavailable, or less effective than established self-help methods. This evolutionary process produced neither purely state-based nor entirely self-help systems, but pragmatic combinations addressing practical needs through multiple complementary mechanisms. Legal evidence from later written sources reveals sophisticated understanding of intentionality, circumstance, and mitigation, long before formal philosophical articulation of these concepts in European legal tradition. Norse law distinguished between intentional harm, accidental injury, and various intermediate categories, carrying different compensation requirements and social consequences. Killing during declared feud or open conflict carried different implications than secret murder, lacking proper notification procedures. Self-defense claims received specific evaluation procedures, determining their validity rather than automatic acceptance or rejection. Circumstances like extreme hunger, imminent danger, or protecting dependents could mitigate otherwise prohibited actions through explicit provisions rather than merely informal consideration. This nuanced approach belies simplistic portrayal of Norse law as primitive or undeveloped, revealing instead sophisticated understanding of human action, complexity, and moral evaluation, requiring differentiated responses according to specific circumstances rather than rigid categorical applications regardless of context. The treatment of outsiders within Norse legal systems revealed both pragmatic flexibility and clear status differentiation based on established relationships rather than merely inherent characteristics. Foreign merchants received specific protections while trading within Norse communities, with customary arrangements establishing their rights, obligations, and dispute resolution mechanisms despite lacking normal community membership. These provisions created sufficient security, enabling commerce beneficial to both visitors and host communities, without requiring full integration or permanent relationship. Other outsiders, travelers, refugees, or migrants occupied more ambiguous positions depending on whether specific community members provided formal or informal sponsorship, integrating them within existing social networks. Those lacking such connections remained vulnerable, with limited protection beyond basic hospitality customs, unless they established specific relationships with established community members who would advocate for their interests within local legal frameworks. This approach prioritized relational standing over abstract rights, creating a flexible system addressing practical needs through specific relationships, rather than universal principles applied regardless of community connection. Legal knowledge transmission occurred primarily through participation observation rather than formal education, with children learning system functions by witnessing thing proceedings, household dispute resolutions, and community responses to various infractions. Young people accompanied adult family members to assemblies, observing procedures while gradually increasing direct participation as they matured. This experiential learning created population-wide basic legal literacy regarding community standards, appropriate resolution methods, and procedural requirements for advancing legitimate claims. While specialized legal roles like law speaker required exceptional knowledge beyond ordinary understanding, general population possessed sufficient legal comprehension to participate effectively in system designed for community implementation rather than professional operation. This distributed knowledge approach created a resilient legal system existing primarily within collective community understanding, rather than dependent on vulnerable specialized institutions that might collapse under pressure, or isolated documents subject to destruction or manipulation. The transition toward Christian legal concepts occurred gradually rather than through sudden replacement, creating hybrid systems incorporating elements from both traditions through pragmatic adaptation rather than theoretical purity. Christian concepts regarding individual responsibility gradually modified traditional kinship liability aspects, though family obligations remained significant long after a theoretical shift toward individual accountability. Increasingly centralized royal authority claimed divine sanction through Christian frameworks, gradually replacing thing-centered governance with royally appointed officials operating under monarchical authority rather than community delegation. Church courts established separate jurisdiction, addressing specifically religious matters, while gradually expanding authority into areas previously handled through secular procedures. These evolutionary changes produced neither pure continuity nor complete replacement, but synthesized system incorporating elements from both traditions through practical adjustments, addressing specific needs, rather than wholesale adoption of foreign models regardless of local circumstances. The Norse legal tradition ultimately represented sophisticated achievement, balancing individual protection against community harmony, procedural regularity against practical flexibility, and traditional authority against emerging institutional forms. Rather than primitive precursor to more advanced legal systems or independent development isolated from wider European traditions, Norse law embodied distinctive approach to universal human challenges regarding social order maintenance, dispute resolution, and justice provision within specific environmental, technological, and cultural context. Understanding this sophisticated legal achievement reveals Norse society not as lawless barbarians, counterposed against civilized southern neighbors, but as innovative problem solvers, developing effective governance mechanisms suited to their particular circumstances, while capable of evolution when conditions changed or new approaches offered advantages over traditional methods. This pragmatic adaptability, balancing innovation against traditional wisdom, characterized Norse approach to governance as it did other aspects of their remarkable culture.